Chapter 1 of The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett. Chapter 1. The Lady with the Dog, Part 1. It was said that a new person had appeared on the seafront. A lady with a little dog. Dmitri Dmitritch Gurov, who had by then been a fortnight at Yalta, and so was fairly at home there, had begun to take an interest in new arrivals. Sitting in Verney's pavilion, he saw, walking on the seafront, a fair-haired young lady of medium height, wearing a beret. A white Pomeranian dog was running behind her. And afterwards he met her in the public gardens and in the square several times a day. She was walking alone, always wearing the same beret, and always with the same white dog. No one knew who she was, and every one called her simply the lady with the dog. "If she is here alone without husband or friends, it wouldn't be amiss to make her acquaintance," Gurov reflected. He was under 40, but he had a daughter, already 12 years old, and 2 sons at school. He had been married young, when he was a student in his 2nd year, and by now his wife seemed half as old again as he. She was a tall, erect woman, with dark eyebrows, staid and dignified, and, as she said of herself, intellectual. She read a great deal, used phonetic spelling, called her husband not Dmitri, but Dimitri, and he secretly considered her unintelligent, narrow, inelegant, was afraid of her, and did not like to be at home. He had begun being unfaithful to her long ago, had been unfaithful to her often, and probably on that account almost always spoke ill of women, and when they were talked about in his presence, used to call them the lower race. It seemed to him that he had been so schooled by bitter experience that he might call them what he liked, and yet he could not get on for 2 days together without the lower race. In the society of men he was bored and not himself. With them he was cold and uncommunicative. But when he was in the company of women he felt free, and knew what to say to them, and how to behave, and he was at ease with them even when he was silent. In his appearance, in his character, in his whole nature there was something attractive and elusive which allured women, and disposed them in his favour. He knew that, and some force seemed to draw him too to them. Experience often repeated, truly bitter experience, had taught him long ago that with decent people, especially Moscow people, always slow to move and irresolute, every intimacy which at first so agreeably diversifies life and appears a light and charming adventure, inevitably grows into a regular problem of extreme intricacy, and in the long run the situation becomes unbearable. But at every fresh meeting with an interesting woman this experience seemed to slip out of his memory, and he was eager for life, and everything seemed simple and amusing. One evening he was dining in the gardens, and the lady in the beret came up slowly to take the next table. Her expression, her gait, her dress, and the way she did her hair told him that she was a lady, that she was married, that she was in Yalta for the first time and alone, and that she was dull there. The stories told of the immorality in such places as Yalta are to a great extent untrue. He despised them, and he knew that such stories were for the most part made up by persons who would themselves have been glad to sin if they had been able. But when the lady sat down at the next table 3 paces from him, he remembered these tales of easy conquests, of trips to the mountains, and the tempting thought of a swift, fleeting love affair, a romance with an unknown woman whose name he did not know suddenly took possession of him. He beckoned coaxingly to the Pomeranian, and when the dog came up to him he shook his finger at it. The Pomeranian growled. Gurov shook his finger at it again. The lady looked at him, and at once dropped her eyes. "He doesn't bite," she said, and blushed. "May I give him a bone?" he asked, and when she nodded, he asked courteously, "Have you been long in Yalta?" "5 days." "And I have already dragged out a fortnight here." There was a brief silence. "Time goes fast, and yet it is so dull here," she said, not looking. "That's only the fashion to say it is dull here. A provincial will live in Belyov or Zhidra and not be dull, and when he comes here, it's, oh, the dullness, oh, the dust. One would think he came from Grenada." She laughed. Then they both continued eating in silence, like strangers. But after dinner they walked side by side, and there sprang up between them the light, jesting conversation of people who are free and satisfied, to whom it does not matter where they go or what they talk about. They walked and talked of the strange light on the sea. The water was of a soft, warm lilac hue, and there was a golden streak from the moon upon it. They talked of how sultry it was after a hot day. Gurov told her that he came from Moscow, that he had taken his degree in arts, but had a post in a bank, that he had trained as an opera singer, but had given it up, that he owned 2 houses in Moscow, and from her he learnt that she had grown up in Petersburg, but had lived in S since her marriage 2 years before, that she was staying another month in Yalta, and that her husband, who needed a holiday too, might perhaps come and fetch her. She was not sure whether her husband had a post in a Crown department or under the provincial council, and was amused by her own ignorance. And Gurov learnt, too, that she was called Anna Sergeyevna. Afterwards he thought about her in his room at the hotel, thought she would certainly meet him next day. It would be sure to happen. As he got into bed he thought how lately she had been a girl at school, doing lessons like his own daughter. He recalled the diffidence, the angularity that was still manifest in her laugh and her manner of talking with the stranger. This must have been the first time in her life she had been alone in surroundings in which she was followed, looked at, and spoken to merely from a secret motive which she could hardly fail to guess. He recalled her slender, delicate neck, her lovely grey eyes. "There's something pathetic about her, anyway," he thought, and went to sleep. II. A week had passed since they had made acquaintance. It was a holiday. It was sultry indoors, while in the street the wind whirled the dust round and round, and blew people's hats off. It was a thirsty day, and Gurov often went into the pavilion and pressed Anna Sergeyevna to have syrup and water or an ice. One did not know what to do with oneself. In the evening, when the wind had dropped a little, they went out on the groyne to see the steamer come in. There were a great many people walking about the harbour. They had gathered to welcome some one, bringing bouquets, and 2 peculiarities of a well-dressed Yalta crowd were very conspicuous. The elderly ladies were dressed like young ones, and there were great numbers of generals. Owing to the roughness of the sea, the steamer arrived late, after the sun had set, and it was a long time turning about before it reached the groyne. Anna Sergeyevna looked through her lorgnette at the steamer and the passengers as though looking for acquaintances, and when she turned to Gurov, her eyes were shining. She talked a great deal and asked disconnected questions, forgetting next moment what she had asked. Then she dropped her lorgnette in the crush. The festive crowd began to disperse. It was too dark to see people's faces. The wind had completely dropped, but Gurov and Anna Sergeyevna still stood as though waiting to see someone else come from the steamer. Anna Sergeyevna was silent now, and sniffed the flowers without looking at Gurov. "The weather is better this evening," he said. "Where shall we go now? Shall we drive somewhere?" She made no answer. Then he looked at her intently, and all at once put his arm around her and kissed her on the lips, and breathed in the moisture and the fragrance of the flowers, and he immediately looked round him, anxiously wondering whether any one had seen them. "Let's go to your hotel," he said softly, and both walked quickly. The room was close and smelt of the scent she had bought at the Japanese shop. Gurov looked at her and thought, what different people one meets in the world. From the past he preserved memories of careless, good-natured women who loved cheerfully and were grateful to him for the happiness he gave them, however brief it might be, and of women like his wife who loved without any genuine feeling, with superfluous phrases, affectedly, hysterically, with an expression that suggested that it was not love nor passion, but something more significant, and of two or three others, very beautiful, cold women, on whose faces he had caught a glimpse of rapacious expression, an obstinate desire to snatch from life more than it could give, and these were capricious, unreflecting, domineering, unintelligent women, not in their first youth. And when Gurov grew cold to them, their beauty excited his hatred, and the lace on their linen seemed to him like scales. But in this case there was still the diffidence, the angularity of inexperienced youth, an awkward feeling, and there was a sense of consternation, as though some one had suddenly knocked at the door. The attitude of Anna Sergeyevna, the lady with the dog, to what had happened was somehow peculiar, very grave, as though it were her fall, so it seemed, and it was strange and inappropriate. Her face dropped and faded, and on both sides of it her long hair hung down mournfully. She mused in a dejected attitude, like the woman who was a sinner in an old-fashioned picture. "It's wrong," she said. "You will be the first to despise me now." There was a watermelon on the table. Gurov cut himself a slice and began eating it without haste. There followed at least half an hour of silence. Anna Sergeyevna was touching. There was about her the purity of a good, simple woman who had seen little of life. The solitary candle burning on the table threw a faint light on her face, yet it was clear that she was very unhappy. "How could I despise you?" asked Gurov. "You don't know what you are saying." "God forgive me," she said, and her eyes filled with tears. "It's awful." "You seem to feel you need to be forgiven." "Forgiven? No. I am a bad, low woman. I despise myself, and don't attempt to justify myself. It's not my husband, but myself I have deceived. And not only just now. I have been deceiving myself for a long time. My husband may be a good, honest man, but he is a flunkey. I don't know what he does there, what his work is, but I know he is a flunkey. I was 20 when I was married to him. I have been tormented by curiosity. I wanted something better. There must be a different sort of life, I said to myself. I wanted to live, to live, to live. I was fired by curiosity. You don't understand it, but I swear to God, I could not control myself. Something happened to me. I could not be restrained. I told my husband I was ill, and came here. And here I have been walking about as though I were dazed, like a mad creature, and now I have become a vulgar, contemptible woman whom anyone may despise. Gurov felt bored already listening to her. He was irritated by the naive tone, by this remorse so unexpected and inopportune. But for the tears in her eyes he might have thought she was jesting or playing a part. "I don't understand," he said softly. "What is it you want?" She hid her face on his breast and pressed close to him. Believe me, I beseech you," she said. "I love a pure, honest life, and sin is loathsome to me. I don't know what I am doing. Simple people say, 'The evil one has beguiled me,' and I may say of myself now that the evil one has beguiled me." "Hush, hush," he muttered. He looked at her fixed, scared eyes, kissed her, talked softly and affectionately, and by degrees she was comforted, and her gaiety returned, and they both began laughing. Afterwards, when they went out, there was not a soul on the sea-front. The town with its cypresses had quite a death-like air, but the sea still broke noisily on the shore. A single barge was rocking on the waves, and a lantern was blinking sleepily on it. They found a cab and drove to Oryanda. "I found out your surname in the hall just now. It was written on the board, von Diederitz," said Gurov. "Is your husband a German?" "No, I believe his grandfather was a German, but he is an Orthodox Russian himself." At Oryanda they sat on a seat not far from the church, looked down at the sea, and were silent. Yalta was hardly visible through the morning mist. White clouds stood motionless on the mountain tops. The leaves did not stir on the trees, grasshoppers chirruped, and the monotonous hollow sound of the sea rising up from below spoke of the peace, of the eternal sleep awaiting us. So it must have sounded when there was no Yalta, no Oryanda here. So it sounds now, and it will sound as indifferently and monotonously when we are all no more. And in this constancy, in this complete indifference to the life and death of each of us, there lies hid perhaps a pledge of our eternal salvation, of the unceasing movement of life upon earth, of unceasing progress toward perfection. Sitting beside a young woman who in the dawn seemed so lovely, soothed and spellbound in these magical surroundings, the sea, mountains, clouds, the open sky, Gurov thought how in reality everything is beautiful in this world when one reflects, everything except what we think or do ourselves when we forget our human dignity and the higher aims of our existence. A man walked up to them, probably a keeper, looked at them and walked away. And this detail seemed mysterious and beautiful too. They saw a steamer come from Theodosia, with its lights out in the glow of dawn. "There is dew on the grass," said Anna Sergeyevna after a silence. "Yes, it's time to go home." They went back to town. Then they met every day at 12 o'clock on the sea-front, lunched and dined together, went for walks, admired the sea. She complained that she slept badly, that her heart throbbed violently, asked the same questions, troubled now by jealousy and now by the fear that he did not respect her sufficiently, and often in the square or gardens, when there was no one near them, he suddenly drew her to him and kissed her passionately. Complete idleness, these kisses in broad daylight, while he looked round in dread of some one else's seeing them. The heat, the smell of the sea, and the continual passing to and fro before him of idle, well-dressed, well-fed people made a new man of him. He told Anna Sergeyevna how beautiful she was, how fascinating. He was impatiently passionate. He would not move a step away from her, while she was often pensive and continually urged him to confess that he did not respect her, did not love her in the least, and thought of her as nothing but a common woman. Rather late almost every evening they drove somewhere out of town, to Oreanda, to the waterfall, and the expedition was always a success. The scenery invariably impressed them as grand and beautiful. They were expecting her husband to come, but a letter came from him saying that there was something wrong with his eyes, and he entreated his wife to come home as quickly as possible. Anna Sergeyevna made haste to go. "It's a good thing I am going away," she said to Gurov. "It's the finger of destiny." She went by coach, and he went with her. They were driving the whole day. When she had got into a compartment of the express, and when the second bell had rung, she said, "Let me look at you once more, look at you once again. That's right." She did not shed tears, but was so sad that she seemed ill, and her face was quivering. "I shall remember you, think of you," she said. "God be with you. Be happy. Don't remember evil against me. We are parting forever. It must be so, for we ought never to have met. Well, God be with you." The train moved off rapidly. Its light soon vanished from sight, and a minute later there was no sound of it, as though everything had conspired together to end as quickly as possible that sweet delirium, that madness. Left alone on the platform, and gazing into the dark distance, Gurov listened to the chirp of the grasshoppers and the hum of the telegraph wires, feeling as though he had only just waked up. And he thought, musing, that there had been another episode or adventure in his life, and it too was at an end, and nothing was left of it but a memory. He was moved, sad, and conscious of a slight remorse. This young woman, whom he would never meet again, had not been happy with him. He was genuinely warm and affectionate with her, but yet in his manner, his tone, and his caresses there had been a shade of light irony, the coarse condescension of a happy man who was, besides, almost twice her age. All the time she had called him kind, exceptional, lofty. Obviously he had seemed to her different from what he really was, so he had unintentionally deceived her. Here at the station was already a scent of autumn. It was a cold evening. "It's time for me to go north," thought Gurov as he left the platform. "High time." 3. At home in Moscow everything was in its winter routine. The stoves were heated, and in the morning it was still dark when the children were having breakfast and getting ready for school, and the nurse would light the lamp for a short time. The frosts had begun already. When the first snow has fallen, on the first day of sleigh driving, it is pleasant to see the white earth, the white roofs, to draw a soft, delicious breath, and the season brings back the days of one's youth. The old limes and birches, white with hoarfrost, have a good-natured expression. They are nearer to one's heart than cypresses and palms, and near them one doesn't want to be thinking of the sea and the mountains. Gurov was Moscow-born. He arrived in Moscow on a fine frosty day, and when he put on his fur coat and warm gloves and walked along Petrovka, and when on Saturday evening he heard the ringing of the bells, his recent trip and the places he had seen lost all charm for him. Little by little he became absorbed in Moscow life, greedily read 3 newspapers a day, and declared he did not read the Moscow papers on principle. He already felt a longing to go to restaurants, clubs, dinner parties, anniversary celebrations, and he felt flattered at entertaining distinguished lawyers and artists, and at playing cards with a professor at the doctor's club. He could already eat a whole plateful of salt fish and cabbage. In another month, he fancied, the image of Anna Sergeyevna would be shrouded in a mist in his memory, and only from time to time would visit him in his dreams with a touching smile, as others did. But more than a month passed, real winter had come, and everything was still clear in his memory, as though he had parted with Anna Sergeyevna only the day before. And his memories glowed more and more vividly, when in the evening stillness he heard from his study the voices of his children preparing their lessons, or when he listened to a song, or the organ at the restaurant, or the storm howled in the chimney. Suddenly everything would rise up in his memory, what had happened on the groyne, and the early morning with the mist on the mountains, and the steamer coming from Theodosia, and the kisses. He would pace a long time about his room, remembering it all and smiling. Then his memories passed into dreams, and in his fancy the past was mingled with what was to come. Anna Sergeyevna did not visit him in dreams, but followed him about everywhere, like a shadow, and haunted him. When he shut his eyes he saw her as though she were living before him, and she seemed to him lovelier, younger, tenderer than she was, and he imagined himself finer than he had been at Yalta. In the evening she peeped out at him from the bookcase, from the fireplace, from the corner. He heard her breathing, the caressing rustle of her dress. In the street he watched the women, looking for someone like her. He was tormented by an intense desire to confide his memories to someone, but in his home it was impossible to talk of his love, and he had no one outside. He could not talk to his tenants, nor to anyone at the bank. And what had he to talk of? Had he been in love then? Had there been anything beautiful, poetical, or edifying, or simply interesting in his relations with Anna Sergeyevna? And there was nothing for him but to talk vaguely of love, of woman, and no one guessed what it meant. Only his wife twitched her black eyebrows and said, "The part of the lady-killer does not suit you at all, Dmitri." One evening, coming out of the doctor's club with an official with whom he had been playing cards, he could not resist saying, "If only you knew what a fascinating woman I made the acquaintance of in Yalta." The official got into his sleigh and was driving away, but turned suddenly and shouted, "Dmitri Dmitritch!" "What?" "You were right this evening. The sturgeon was a bit too strong." These words, so ordinary, for some reason moved Gurov to indignation, and struck him as degrading and unclean. What savage manners, what people, what senseless nights, what uninteresting, uneventful days! The rage for card-playing, the gluttony, the drunkenness, the continual talk always about the same thing. Useless pursuits and conversations always about the same things, absorb the better part of one's time, the better part of one's strength, and in the end there is left a life grovelling and curtailed, worthless and trivial. There is no escaping or getting away from it, just as though one were in a madhouse or a prison. Gurov did not sleep all night and was filled with indignation. And he had a headache all next day, and the next night he slept badly. He sat up in bed, thinking, or paced up and down in his room. He was sick of his children, sick of the bank. He had no desire to go anywhere or talk of anything. In the holidays in December he prepared for a journey and told his wife he was going to Petersburg to do something in the interests of a young friend, and he set off for S. What for? He did not very well know himself. He wanted to see Anna Sergeyevna and to talk with her, to arrange a meeting if possible. He reached S. in the morning and took the best room at the hotel, in which the floor was covered with grey army cloth, and on the table was an inkstand, grey with dust, and adorned with a figure on horseback, with its hat in its hand and its head broken off. The hotel porter gave him the necessary information. Von Dideritz lived in a house of his own in Old Goncharny Street. It was not far from the hotel. He was rich and lived in good style, and had his own horses. Every one in town knew him. The porter pronounced his name Dideritz. Gurov went without haste to Old Goncharny Street and found the house. Just opposite the house stretched a long grey fence adorned with nails. "One would run away from a fence like that," thought Gurov, looking from the fence to the windows of the house and back again. He considered. Today was a holiday, and the husband would probably be at home, and in any case it would be tactless to go into the house and upset her. If he were to send her a note, it might fall into her husband's hands, and then it might ruin everything. The best thing was to trust to chance, and he kept walking up and down the street by the fence, waiting for the chance. He saw a beggar go in at the gate and the dogs fly at him. Then an hour later he heard a piano, and the sounds were faint and indistinct. Probably it was Anna Sergeyevna playing. The front door suddenly opened, and an old woman came out, followed by the familiar white Pomeranian. Gurov was on the point of calling to the dog, but his heart began beating violently, and in his excitement he could not remember the dog's name. He walked up and down and loathed the grey fence more and more, and by now he thought irritably that Anna Sergeyevna had forgotten him, and was probably already amusing herself with someone else, and that was very natural in a young woman who had nothing to look at from morning till night but that confounded fence. He went back to his hotel room and sat for a long while on the sofa, not knowing what to do. Then he had dinner and a long nap. "How stupid and worrying it is," he thought when he woke and looked at the dark windows. It was already evening. "Here I've had a good sleep for some reason. What shall I do in the night?" He sat on the bed, which was covered by a cheap grey blanket, such as one sees in hospitals, and he taunted himself in his vexation. "So much for the lady with the dog, so much for adventure. You're in a nice fix." That morning at the station a poster in large letters caught his eye. The geisha was to be performed for the first time. He thought of this and went to the theatre. "It's quite possible she may go to the first performance," he thought. The theatre was full. As in all provincial theatres, there was a fog above the chandelier. The gallery was noisy and restless. In the front row the local dandies were standing up before the beginning of the performance. with their hands behind them. In the governor's box the governor's daughter, wearing a boa, was sitting in the front seat, while the governor himself lurked modestly behind the curtains with only his hands visible. The orchestra was a long time tuning up. The stage curtain swayed. All the time the audience were coming in and taking their seats. Gurov looked at them eagerly. Anna Sergeyevna, too, came in. She sat down in the third row, and when Gurov looked at her his heart contracted, and he understood clearly that for him there was in the whole world no creature so near, so precious, and so important to him. She, this little woman, in no way remarkable, lost in a provincial crowd, with a vulgar lorgnette in her hand, filled his whole life now, was his sorrow and his joy, the one happiness that he now desired for himself. And to the sounds of the inferior orchestra, of the wretched provincial violins, he thought how lovely she was. He thought and dreamed. A young man with small side-whiskers, tall and stooping, came in with Anna Sergeyevna and sat down beside her. He bent his head at every step and seemed to be continually bowing. Most likely this was the husband, whom at Yalta, in a rush of bitter feeling, she had called a flunkey. And there really was in his long figure, his side-whiskers, and the small bald patch on his head, something of the flunkey's obsequiousness. His smile was sugary. In his buttonhole there was some badge of distinction, like the number on a waiter. During the first interval the husband went away to smoke. She remained alone in her stall. Gurov, who was sitting in the stalls too, went up to her and said in a trembling voice, with a forced smile, "Good evening." She glanced at him and turned pale, then glanced again with horror, unable to believe her eyes, and tightly gripped the fan and the lorgnette in her hands, evidently struggling with herself not to faint. Both were silent. She was sitting, he was standing, frightened by her confusion and not venturing to sit down beside her. The violins and the flute began tuning up. He felt suddenly frightened. It seemed as though all the people in the boxes were looking at them. She got up and went quickly to the door. He followed her, and both walked senselessly along the passages and up and down stairs, and figures in legal, scholastic, and civil service uniforms, all wearing badges, flitted before their eyes. They caught glimpses of ladies of fur coats hanging on the pegs. The draughts blew on them, bringing a smell of stale tobacco, and Gurov, whose heart was beating violently, thought, "Oh, heavens, why are these people here in this orchestra?" And at that instant he recalled how, when he had seen Anna Sergeyevna off at the station, he had thought that everything was over and they would never meet again. But how far they were still from the end! On the narrow, gloomy staircase, over which was written, "To the amphitheatre," she stopped. "How you have frightened me!" she said, breathing hard, still pale and overwhelmed. "Oh, how you have frightened me! I am half dead. Why have you come? Why?" "But do understand, Anna, do understand," he said hastily in a low voice. "I entreat you to understand." She looked at him with dread, with entreaty, with love. She looked at him intently to keep his features more distinctly in her memory. "I am so unhappy," she went on, not heeding him. "I have thought of nothing but you all the time. I live only in the thought of you. And I wanted to forget you. But why, oh, why have you come?" On the landing above them 2 schoolboys were smoking and looking down, but that was nothing to Gurov. He drew Anna Sergeyevna to him and began kissing her face, her cheeks, and her hands. "What are you doing? What are you doing?" she cried in horror, pushing him away. "We are mad. Go away today. Go away at once. I beseech you, by all that is sacred, I implore you. There are people coming this way." Someone was coming up the stairs. "You must go away," Anna Sergeyevna went on in a whisper. "Do you hear, Dmitri Dmitritch? I will come and see you in Moscow. I have never been happy. I am miserable now, and I never, never shall be happy, never. Don't make me suffer still more. I swear I'll come to Moscow. But now let us part. My precious, good, dear one, we must part." She pressed his hand and began rapidly going downstairs, looking round at him, and from her eyes he could see that she really was unhappy. Gurov stood for a little while, listened. Then, when all sound had died away, he found his coat and left the theatre. 4. And Anna Sergeyevna began coming to see him in Moscow. Once in 2 or 3 months she left S., telling her husband that she was going to consult a doctor about an internal complaint, and her husband believed her, and did not believe her. In Moscow she stayed at the Slavyansky Bazaar Hotel, and at once sent a man in a red cap to Gurov. Gurov went to see her, and no one in Moscow knew of it. Once he was going to see her in this way on a winter morning. The messenger had come the evening before when he was out. With him walked his daughter, whom he wanted to take to school. It was on the way. Snow was falling in big wet flakes. "It's 3 degrees above freezing point, and yet it is snowing," said Gurov to his daughter. "The thaw is only on the surface of the earth. There is quite a different temperature at a greater height in the atmosphere."
"And why are there no thunderstorms in the winter, father?"
He explained that too. He talked, thinking all the while that he was going to see her, and no living soul knew of it, and probably never would know. He had 2 lives, one open, seen, and known by all who have cared to know, full of relative truth and of relative falsehood, exactly like the lives of his friends and acquaintances, and another life running its course in secret. And through some strange, perhaps accidental conjunction of circumstances, everything that was essential, of interest and of value to him, everything in which he was sincere and did not deceive himself, everything that made the kernel of his life, was hidden from other people, and all that was false in him, the sheath in which he hid himself to conceal the truth, such, for instance, as his work in the bank, his discussions at the club, his lower race, his presence with his wife at anniversary festivities, all that was open, and he judged of others by himself, not believing in what he saw, and always believing that every man had his real, most interesting life under the cover of secrecy and under the cover of night. All personal life rested on secrecy, and possibly it was partly on that account that civilized man was so nervously anxious that personal privacy should be respected. After leaving his daughter at school, Gurov went on to the Slavyansky Bazaar. He took off his fur coat below, went upstairs, and softly knocked at the door. Anna Sergeyevna, wearing his favourite grey dress, exhausted by the journey and the suspense, had been expecting him since the evening before. She was pale. She looked at him and did not smile, and he had hardly come in when she fell on his breast. Their kiss was slow and prolonged, as though they had not met for 2 years. "Well, how are you getting on there?" he asked. "What news?"
"Wait, I'll tell you directly. I can't talk."
She could not speak. She was crying. She turned away from him and pressed her handkerchief to her eyes. Let her have her cry out. I'll sit down and wait, he thought, and he sat down in an armchair. Then he rang and asked for tea to be brought him, and while he drank his tea, she remained standing at the window with her back to him. She was crying from emotion, from the miserable consciousness that their life was so hard for them. They could only meet in secret, hiding themselves from people, like thieves. Was not their life shattered? "Come, do stop," he said. It was evident to him that this love of theirs would not soon be over, that he could not see the end of it. Anna Sergeyevna grew more and more attached to him. She adored him, and it was unthinkable to say to her that it was bound to have an end some day. Besides, she would not have believed it. He went up to her and took her by the shoulders to say something affectionate and cheering, and at that moment he saw himself in the looking-glass. His hair was already beginning to turn grey, and it seemed strange to him that he had grown so much older, so much plainer during the last few years. The shoulders on which his hands rested were warm and quivering. He felt compassion for this life, still so warm and lovely, but probably already not far from beginning to fade and wither like his own. Why did she love him so much? He always seemed to women different from what he was, and they loved in him not himself, but the man created by their imagination, whom they had been eagerly seeking all their lives. And afterwards, when they noticed their mistake, they loved him all the same, and not one of them had been happy with him. Time passed. He had made their acquaintance, got on with them, parted, but he had never once loved. It was anything you like, but not love. And only now, when his head was grey, he had fallen properly, really in love, for the first time in his life. Anna Sergeyevna and he loved each other like people very close and akin, like husband and wife, like tender friends. It seemed to them that fate itself had meant them for one another, and they could not understand why he had a wife and she a husband. And it was as though they were a pair of birds of passage, caught and forced to live in different cages. They forgave each other for what they were ashamed of in their past. They forgave everything in the present, and felt that this love of theirs had changed them both. In moments of depression in the past, he had comforted himself with any arguments that came into his mind, but now he no longer cared for arguments. He felt profound compassion. He wanted to be sincere and tender. "Don't cry, my darling," he said. "You've had your cry. That's enough. Let us talk now. Let us think of some plan." Then they spent a long while taking counsel together, talked of how to avoid the necessity for secrecy, for deception, for living in different towns and not seeing each other for long at a time. How could they be free from this intolerable bondage? How? He asked, clutching his head. How? And it seemed as though, in a little while the solution would be found, and then a new and splendid life would begin. And it was clear to both of them that they still had a long, long road before them, and that the most complicated and difficult part of it was only just beginning. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Kevin Davidson. www.blogordie.com Chapter 2 of The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett. Chapter 2. A Doctor's Visit. The professor received a telegram from the Lyalikovs' factory. He was asked to come as quickly as possible. The daughter of some Madame Lyalikov, apparently the owner of the factory, was ill, and that was all that one could make out of the long, incoherent telegram. And the professor did not go himself, but sent his assistant Korolyov. It was 2 stations from Moscow, and there was a drive of 3 miles from the station. A carriage with 3 horses had been sent to the station to meet Korolyov. The coachman wore a hat with a peacock's feather on it, and answered every question in a loud voice like a soldier. "No, sir. Certainly, sir." It was Saturday evening. The sun was setting. The workpeople were coming in crowds from the factory to the station, and they bowed to the carriage in which Korolyov was driving. And he was charmed with the evening, the farmhouses and villas on the road, and the birch trees, and the quiet atmosphere all around, when the fields and woods and sun seemed preparing, like the workpeople, now on the eve of the holiday, to rest, and perhaps to pray. He was born and had grown up in Moscow. He did not know the country, and he had never taken any interest in factories, or been inside one. But he had happened to read about factories, and had been in the houses of manufacturers, and had talked to them. And whenever he saw a factory, far or near, he always thought how quiet and peaceful it was outside, but within there was always sure to be impenetrable ignorance and dull egoism on the side of the owners, wearisome, unhealthy toil on the side of the workpeople, squabbling, vermin, vodka. And now, when the workpeople timidly and respectfully made way for the carriage, in their faces, their caps, their walk, he read physical impurity, drunkenness, nervous exhaustion, bewilderment. They drove in at the factory gates. On each side he caught glimpses of the little houses of workpeople, of the faces of women, of quilts and linen on the railings. "Look out!" shouted the coachman, not pulling up the horses. It was a wide courtyard without grass, with 5 immense blocks of buildings, with tall chimneys, a little distance from one another, warehouses and barracks, and over everything a sort of grey powder, as though from dust. Here and there, like oases in the desert, there were pitiful gardens, and the green and red roofs of the houses in which the managers and clerks lived. The coachman suddenly pulled up the horses, and the carriage stopped at the house, which had been newly painted grey. Here was a flower garden, with a lilac bush covered with dust, and on the yellow steps at the front door there was a strong smell of paint. "Please come in, doctor," said women's voices in the passage and the entry, and at the same time he heard sighs and whisperings. "Pray walk in. We've been expecting you so long. We're in real trouble. Here, this way." Madame Lyalikov, a stout, elderly lady, wearing a black silk dress with fashionable sleeves, but, judging from her face, a simple, uneducated woman, looked at the doctor in a flutter, and could not bring herself to hold out her hand to him. She did not dare. Beside her stood a personage with short hair and a pince-nez. She was wearing a blouse of many colours, and was very thin and no longer young. The servants called her Kristina Dmitrievna, and Korolyov guessed that this was the governess. Perhaps, as the person of most education in the house, she had been charged to meet and receive the doctor, for she began immediately, in great haste, stating the causes of the illness, giving trivial and tiresome details without saying who was ill or what was the matter. The doctor and the governess were sitting, talking, while the lady of the house stood motionless at the door, waiting. From the conversation Korolyov learned that the patient was Madame Lyalikov's only daughter, an heiress, a girl of 20 called Lisa. She had been ill for a long time and had consulted various doctors, and the previous night she had suffered till morning from such violent palpitations of the heart that no one in the house had slept, and they had been afraid she might die. "She has been, one may say, ailing from a child," said Kristina Dmitrievna, in a sing-song voice, continually wiping her lips with her hand. "The doctors say it is nerves. When she was a little girl she was scrofulous, and the doctors drove it inwards, so I think it may be due to that." They went to see the invalid, fully grown up, big and tall, but ugly like her mother, with the same little eyes and disproportionate breadth of the lower part of the face, lying with her hair in disorder, muffled up to the chin. She made upon Korolyov at the first minute the impression of a poor, destitute creature, sheltered and cared for here out of charity, and he could hardly believe that this was the heiress of the 5 huge buildings. "I am the doctor come to see you," said Korolyov. "Good evening." He mentioned his name, and pressed her hand, a large, cold, ugly hand. She sat up, and, evidently accustomed to doctors, she let herself be sounded without showing the least concern that her shoulders and chest were uncovered. "I have palpitations of the heart," she said. "It was so awful all night. I almost died of fright. Do give me something." I will. Don't worry yourself." Korolyov examined her and shrugged his shoulders. "The heart is all right," he said. "It's all going on satisfactorily. Everything is in good order. Your nerves must have been playing pranks a little, but that's so common. The attack is over by now, one must suppose. Lie down and go to sleep." At that moment a lamp was brought into the bedroom. The patient screwed up her eyes at the light, then suddenly put her hands to her head and broke into sobs, and the impression of a destitute, ugly creature vanished, and Korolyov no longer noticed the little eyes or the heavy development of the lower part of the face. He saw a soft, suffering expression, which was intelligent and touching. She seemed to him altogether graceful, feminine, and simple, and he longed to soothe her, not with drugs, not with advice, but with simple, kindly words. Her mother put her arms around her head and hugged her. What despair, what grief was in the old woman's face! She, her mother, had reared her and brought her up, spared nothing, and devoted her whole life to having their daughter taught French, dancing, music, had engaged a dozen teachers for her, had consulted the best doctors, kept a governess. And now she could not make out the reason of these tears, why there was all this misery. She could not understand, and was bewildered. And she had a guilty, agitated, despairing expression, as though she had omitted something very important, had left something undone, and had neglected to call in somebody, and whom she did not know. "Lizanka, you are crying again, again," she said, hugging her daughter to her. "My own, my darling, my child, tell me what it is. Have pity on me, tell me." Both wept bitterly. Korolyov sat down on the side of the bed and took Liza's hand. "Come, give over, it's no use crying," he said kindly. "Why, there is nothing in the world that is worth those tears. Come, we won't cry, that's no good." And inwardly he thought, it's high time she was married. "Our doctor at the factory gave her calibromati," said the governess, "but I notice it only makes her worse. I should have thought that if she is given anything from the heart, it ought to be drops. I forget the name. Convallaria, isn't it?" And there followed all sorts of details. She interrupted the doctor, preventing his speaking, and there was a look of effort on her face, as though she supposed that as the woman of most education in the house, she was duty-bound to keep up a conversation with the doctor, and in no other subject but medicine. Korolyov felt bored. "I find nothing special the matter," he said, addressing the mother as he went out of the bedroom. "If your daughter is being attended by the factory doctor, let him go on attending her. The treatment so far has been perfectly correct, and I see no reason for changing your doctor. Why change? It's such an ordinary trouble, there's nothing seriously wrong." He spoke deliberately, as he put on his gloves, while Madame Lyalikov stood without moving, and looked at him with her tearful eyes. "I have half an hour to catch the 10 o'clock train," he said. "I hope I'm not too late." "And can't you stay?" she asked, and tears trickled down her cheeks again. "I am ashamed to trouble you, but if you would be so good, for God's sake," she went on in an undertone, glancing towards the door, "do stay to-night with us. She's all I have, my only daughter. She frightened me last night. I can't get over it. Don't go away, for goodness' sake." He wanted to tell her he had a great deal of work in Moscow, that his family were expecting him home. It was disagreeable to him to spend the evening and the whole night in a strange house, quite needlessly, but he looked at her face, heaved a sigh, and began taking off his gloves without a word. All the lamps and candles were lighted in his honour in the drawing-room and the dining-room. He sat down at the piano and began turning over the music. Then he looked at the pictures on the walls, at the portraits. The pictures, oil paintings in gold frames, were views of the Crimea, a stormy sea with a ship, a Catholic monk with a wine-glass. They were all dull, smooth daubs, with no trace of talent in them. There was not a single good-looking face among the portraits, nothing but broad cheekbones and astonished-looking eyes. Lyalikov, Liza's father, had a low forehead and a self-satisfied expression. His uniform sat like a sack on his bulky plebeian figure. On his breast was a medal and a Red Cross badge. There was little sign of culture, and the luxury was senseless and haphazard, and was as ill-fitting as that uniform. The floors irritated him with their brilliant polish. The lustres on the chandelier irritated him, and he was reminded, for some reason, of the story of the merchant who used to go to the baths with a medal on his neck. He heard a whispering in the entry. Someone was softly snoring, and suddenly from outside came harsh, abrupt, metallic sounds, such as Korolyov had never heard before, and which he did not understand now. They roused strange, unpleasant echoes in his soul. "I believe nothing would induce me to remain here to live," he thought, and went back to the music books again. "Doctor, please come to supper," the governess called him in a low voice. He went in to supper. The table was large and laid with a vast number of dishes and wines, but there were only two to supper, himself and Christina Dmitrievna. She drank Madeira, ate rapidly, and talked, looking at him through her pince-nez. "Our workpeople are very contented. We have performances at the factory every winter. The workpeople act themselves. They have lectures with a magic lantern, a splendid tea-room, and everything they want. They are very much attached to us, and when they heard that Lizanka was worse, they had a service sung for her. Though they have no education, they have their feelings too." "It looks as though you have no man in the house at all," said Korolyov. "Not one. Pyotr Nikanoritch died 1.5 years ago and left us alone. And so there are the three of us. In the summer we live here, and in the winter we live in Moscow, in Polyanka. I have been living with them for 11 years, as one of the family. At supper they serve sterlet, chicken rissoles, and stewed fruit. The wines are expensive French wines." "Please don't stand on ceremony, doctor," said Christina Dmitrievna, eating and wiping her mouth with her fist, and it was evident she found her life here exceedingly pleasant. "Please have some more." After supper the doctor was shown to his room, where a bed had been made up for him, but he did not feel sleepy. The room was stuffy, and it smelt of paint. He put on his coat and went out. It was cool in the open air. There was already a glimmer of dawn, and all the 5 blocks of buildings with their tall chimneys, barracks, and warehouses were distinctly outlined against the damp air. As it was a holiday, they were not working, and the windows were dark, and in only one of the buildings was there a furnace burning. 2 windows were crimson, and fire mixed with smoke came from time to time from the chimney. Far away beyond the yard the frogs were croaking and the nightingales singing. Looking at the factory buildings and the barracks, where the workpeople were asleep, he thought again what he always thought when he saw a factory. They may have performances for the workpeople, magic lanterns, factory doctors, and improvements of all sorts, but all the same, the workpeople he had met that day on his way from the station did not look in any way different from those he had known long ago in his childhood, before there were factory performances and improvements. As a doctor, accustomed to judging correctly of chronic complaints, the radical cause of which was incomprehensible and incurable, he looked upon factories as something baffling, the cause of which also was obscure and not removable, and all the improvements in the life of the factory hands he looked upon not as superfluous, but as comparable with the treatment of incurable illnesses. "There is something baffling in it, of course," he thought, looking at the crimson windows. 1,500 or 2,000 workpeople are working without rest in unhealthy surroundings, making bad cotton goods, living on the verge of starvation, and only waking from this nightmare at rare intervals in the tavern. 100 people act as overseers, and the whole life of that 100 is spent in imposing fines, in abuse, in injustice, and only 2 or 3 so-called owners enjoy the profits, though they don't work at all, and despise the wretched cotton. But what are the profits, and how do they enjoy them? Madame Lyalikov and her daughter are unhappy. It makes one wretched to look at them. The only one who enjoys her life is Christina Dmitrievna, a stupid, middle-aged maiden lady in pince-nez, and so it appears that all these 5 blocks of buildings are at work, and inferior cotton is sold in the eastern markets, simply that Christina Dmitrievna may eat sterlet and drink Madeira. Suddenly there came a strange noise, the same sound Korolyov had heard before supper. Someone was striking on a sheet of metal near one of the buildings. He struck a note, and then at once checked the vibrations, so that short, abrupt, discordant sounds were produced, rather like "der, der, der." Then there was half a minute of stillness, and from another building there came sounds, equally abrupt and unpleasant, lower bass notes. "Drin, drin, drin," 11 times. Evidently it was the watchman striking the hour. Near the third building he heard "zhuk, zhuk, zhuk," and so near all the buildings, and then behind the barracks and beyond the gates. And in the stillness of the night it seemed as though these sounds were uttered by a monster with crimson eyes, the devil himself, who controlled the owners and the work-people alike, and was deceiving both. Korolyov went out of the yard into the open country. "Who goes there?" someone called to him at the gates in an abrupt voice. "It's just like being in prison," and made no answer. Here the nightingales and the frogs could be heard more distinctly, and one could feel it was a night in May. From the station came the noise of a train. Somewhere in the distance drowsy cocks were crowing. But all the same, the night was still, the world was sleeping tranquilly. In a field not far from the factory there could be seen the framework of a house and heaps of building material. Korolyov sat down on the planks and went on thinking. "The only person who feels happy here is the governess, and the factory hands are working for her gratification. But that's only apparent. She is only the figurehead. The real person for whom everything is being done is the devil." And he thought about the devil, in whom he did not believe, and he looked round at the 2 windows where the fires were gleaming. It seemed to him that out of those crimson eyes the devil himself was looking at him, that unknown force that had created the mutual relation of the strong and the weak, that coarse blunder which one could never correct. The strong must hinder the weak from living, such was the law of nature, but only in a newspaper article or in a school book was that intelligible and easily accepted. In the hotchpotch which was everyday life, in the tangle of trivialities out of which human relations were woven, it was no longer a law, but a logical absurdity. When the strong and the weak were both equally victims of their mutual relations, unwillingly submitting to some directing force unknown, standing outside life, apart from man. So thought Korolyov, sitting on the planks, and little by little he was possessed by a feeling that this unknown and mysterious force was really close by and looking at him. Meanwhile the east was growing paler. Time passed rapidly, when there was not a soul anywhere near, as though everything were dead, the 5 buildings and their chimneys against the grey background of the dawn had a peculiar look. not the same as by day. One forgot altogether that inside there were steam motors, electricity, telephones, and kept thinking of lake dwellings, of the Stone Age, feeling the presence of a crude, unconscious force. And again there came the sound, "Dear, dear, dear, dear," 12 times. Then there was stillness for half a minute, and then at the other end of the yard there rang out, "Trin, Trin, Trin." Horribly disagreeable, thought Korolyov. Zhuk, zhuk. There resounded from a third place, abruptly, sharply, as though with a noise, zhuk, zhuk, and it took 4 minutes to strike 12. Then there was a hush, and again it seemed as though everything were dead. Korolyov sat a little longer, then went to the house, but sat up for a good while longer. In the adjoining rooms there was whispering. There was a sound of shuffling slippers and bare feet. "Is she having another attack?" thought Korolyov. He went out to have a look at the patient. By now it was quite light in the rooms, and a faint glimmer of sunlight, piercing through the morning mist, quivered on the floor and on the wall of the drawing-room. The door of Liza's room was open, and she was sitting in a low chair beside her bed, with her hair down, wearing a dressing-gown and wrapped in a shawl. The blinds were down on the windows. "How do you feel?" asked Korolyov. "Well, thank you." He touched her pulse, then straightened her hair that had fallen over her forehead. "You're not asleep," he said. "It is beautiful weather outside. It's spring. The nightingales are singing, and you sit in the dark and think of something." She listened and looked into his face. Her eyes were sorrowful and intelligent, and it was evident she wanted to say something to him. "Does this happen to you often?" he said. She moved her lips and answered, "Often I feel wretched almost every night." At that moment the watchman in the yard began striking 2 o'clock. They heard, "Dear, dear," and she shuddered. "Do those knockings worry you?" he asked. "I don't know. Everything here worries me," she answered and pondered. "Everything worries me. I hear sympathy in your voice. It seemed to me, as soon as I saw you, that I could tell you all about it." "Tell me, I beg you." "I want to tell you of my opinion. It seems to me that I have no illness, but that I am weary and frightened, because it is bound to be so and cannot be otherwise. Even the healthiest person can't help being uneasy. If, for instance, a robber is moving about under his window, I am constantly being doctored," she went on, looking at her knees, and she gave a shy smile. "I am very grateful, of course, and I do not deny that the treatment is a benefit, but I should like to talk, not with a doctor, but with some intimate friend who would understand me and would convince me that I was right or wrong." "Have you no friends?" asked Korolyov. "I am lonely. I have a mother. I love her, but all the same I am lonely. That's how it happens to be. Lonely people read a great deal, but say little and hear little. Life for them is mysterious. They are mystics, and often see the devil where he is not. Lermontov's Tamara was lonely, and she saw the devil." "Do you read a great deal?" "Yes. You see, my whole time is free, from morning till night. I read by day, and by night my head is empty. Instead of thoughts, there are shadows in it." "Do you see anything at night?" asked Korolyov. "No, but I feel She smiled again, raised her eyes to the doctor, and looked at him so sorrowfully, so intelligently, and it seemed to him that she trusted him, and that she wanted to speak frankly to him, and that she thought the same as he did. But she was silent, perhaps waiting for him to speak. And he knew what to say to her. It was clear to him that she needed as quickly as possible to give up the 5 buildings, and the 1,000,000, if she had it, to leave that devil that looked out at night. It was clear to him, too, that she thought so herself, was only waiting for some one she trusted to confirm her. But he did not know how to say it. How? One is shy of asking men under sentence what they have been sentenced for, and in the same way it is awkward to ask very rich people what they want so much money for, why they make such a poor use of their wealth, why they don't give it up, even when they see in it their unhappiness. And if they begin a conversation about it themselves, it is usually embarrassing, awkward, and long. How is one to say it? Korolyov wondered. And is it necessary to speak? And he said what he meant in a roundabout way. You, in the position of a factory owner and a wealthy heiress, are dissatisfied. You don't believe in your right to it, and here now you can't sleep. That, of course, is better than if you were satisfied, slept soundly, and thought everything was satisfactory. Your sleeplessness does you credit. In any case, it is a good sign. In reality, such a conversation as this between us now would have been unthinkable for our parents. At night they did not talk, but slept sound. We, our generation, sleep badly, are restless, but talk a great deal, and are always trying to settle whether we are right or wrong. For our children or grandchildren, that question, whether they are right or not, will have been settled. Things will be clearer for them than for us. Life will be good in 50 years' time. It's only a pity we shall not last out till then. It would be interesting to have a peep at it. What will our children and grandchildren do? Asked Lise. I don't know. I suppose they will throw it all up and go away. Go where? Where? Why, where they like, said Korolyov, and he laughed. There are lots of places a good, intelligent person can go to. He glanced at his watch. The sun has risen, though, he said. It is time you were asleep. Undress and sleep soundly. Very glad to have made your acquaintance, he went on, pressing her hand. You are a good, interesting woman. Good night. He went to his room and went to bed. In the morning, when the carriage was brought round, they all came out onto the steps to see him off. Lise, pale and exhausted, was in a white dress, as though for a holiday, with a flower in her hair. She looked at him as yesterday, sorrowfully and intelligently, smiled and talked, and all with an expression as though she wanted to tell him something special, important, him alone. They could hear the larks trilling and the church bells pealing. The windows in the factory buildings were sparkling gaily, and driving across the yard and afterwards along the road to the station, Korolyov thought neither of the workpeople, nor of lake dwellings, nor of the devil, but thought of the time, perhaps close at hand, when life would be as bright and joyous as that still Sunday morning, and he thought how pleasant it was on such a morning in the spring to drive with 3 horses in a good carriage and to bask in the sunshine.
Chapter 3 of The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov, translated by Constance Garnett. Chapter 3. An Upheaval. Mashenka Pavletsky, a young girl who had only just finished her studies at a boarding school, returning from a walk to the house of the Kushkins with whom she was living as a governess, found the household in a terrible turmoil. Mihailo, the porter who opened the door to her, was excited and red as a crab. Loud voices were heard from upstairs. "Madame Kushkin is in a fit, most likely, or else she has quarrelled with her husband," thought Mashenka. In the hall and in the corridor she met maidservants. One of them was crying. Then Mashenka saw, running out of her room, the master of the house himself, Nikolai Sergeitch, a little man with a flabby face and a bald head, though he was not old. He was red in the face and twitching all over. He passed the governess without noticing her, and throwing up his arms, exclaimed, "Oh, how horrible it is! How tactless! How stupid! How barbarous! Abominable!" Mashenka went into her room, and then, for the first time in her life, it was her lot to experience in all its acuteness the feeling that is so familiar to persons in dependent positions, who eat the bread of the rich and powerful, and cannot speak their minds. There was a search going on in her room. The lady of the house, Fedosya Vassilyevna, a stout, broad-shouldered, uncouth woman with thick black eyebrows, a faintly perceptible moustache, and red hands, who was exactly like a plain illiterate cook in face and manners, was standing without her cap on, at the table, putting back into Mashenka's work-bag balls of wool, scraps of materials, and bits of paper. Evidently the governess's arrival took her by surprise, since on looking around, and seeing the girl's pale and astonished face, she was a little taken aback, and muttered, "Pardon, I upset it accidentally. My sleeve caught in it." And saying something more, Madame Kushkin rustled her long skirts and went out. Mashenka looked round her room with wondering eyes, and, unable to understand it, not knowing what to think, shrugged her shoulders and turned cold with dismay. What had Fedosya Vassilyevna been looking for in her work-bag? If she really had, as she said, caught her sleeve in it and upset everything, why had Nikolai Sergeitch dashed out of her room so excited and red in the face? Why was one drawer of the table pulled out a little way? The money-box, in which the governess put away 10-kopeck pieces and old stamps, was open. They had opened it, but did not know how to shut it, though they had scratched the lock all over. The what-not with her books on it, the things on the table, the bed, all bore fresh traces of a search. Her linen basket, too. The linen had been carefully folded, but it was not in the same order as Mashenka had left it when she went out. So the search had been thorough, most thorough. But what was it for? Why? What had happened? Mashenka remembered the excited porter, the general turmoil which was still going on, the weeping servant girl. Had it not all some connection with the search that had just been made in her room? Was not she mixed up in something dreadful? Mashenka turned pale, and feeling cold all over, sank onto her linen basket. A maidservant came into the room. "Lisa, you don't know why they have been rummaging in my room?" the governess asked her. "Mistress has lost a brooch worth 2,000, said Lisa. "Yes, but why have they been rummaging in my room?" "They've been searching every one, miss. They've searched all my things, too. They stripped us all naked and searched us. God knows, miss, I never went near her toilet table, let alone touching the brooch. I shall say the same at the police station." "But why have they been rummaging here?" the governess still wondered. "A brooch has been stolen, I tell you. The mistress has been rummaging in everything with her own hands. She even searched Mihailo, the porter, herself. It's a perfect disgrace. Nikolay Sergeitch simply looks on and cackles like a hen. But you've no need to tremble like that, miss. They found nothing here. You have nothing to be afraid of if you didn't take the brooch." "But, Liza, it's vile, it's insulting," said Mashenka, breathless with indignation. "It's so mean, so low. What right had she to suspect me and to rummage in my things?" "You are living with strangers, miss," sighed Liza. "Though you are a young lady, still you are, as it were, a servant. It's not like living with your papa and mamma." Mashenka threw herself on the bed and sobbed bitterly. Never in her life had she been subjected to such an outrage. Never had she been so deeply insulted. She, well educated, refined, the daughter of a teacher, was suspected of theft. She had been searched like a street walker. She could not imagine a greater insult. And to this feeling of resentment was added an oppressive dread of what would come next. All sorts of absurd ideas came into her mind. If they could suspect her of theft, then they might arrest her, strip her naked, and search her, then lead her through the street with an escort of soldiers, cast her into a cold dark cell with mice and woodlice, exactly like the dungeon in which Princess Tarakanov was imprisoned. Who would stand up for her? Her parents lived far away in the provinces. They had not the money to come to her. In the capital she was as solitary as in a desert, without friends or kindred. They could do what they liked with her. "I will go to all the courts and all the lawyers," Mashenka thought, trembling. "I will explain to them. I will take an oath. They will believe that I could not be a thief." Mashenka remembered that under the sheets in her basket she had some sweetmeats, which, following the habits of her school days, she had put in her pocket at dinner and carried off to her room. She felt hot all over, and was ashamed at the thought that her little secret was known to the lady of the house. And all this terror, shame, resentment, brought on an attack of palpitation of the heart, which set up a throbbing in her temples, in her heart, and deep down in her stomach. "Dinner is ready," the servant summoned Mashenka. "Shall I go or not?" Mashenka brushed her hair, wiped her face with a wet towel, and went into the dining-room. There they had already begun dinner. At one end of the table sat Fedosya Vassilyevna, with a stupid, solemn, serious face. At the other end Nikolay Sergeitch. At the sides there were the visitors and the children. The dishes were handed by two footmen in swallow-tails and white gloves. Every one knew that there was an upset in the house, that Madame Kushkin was in trouble, and every one was silent. Nothing was heard but the sound of munching and the rattle of spoons on the plates. The lady of the house herself was the first to speak. "What is the third course?" she asked the footman in a weary, injured voice. "Esturgeon à la Russe," answered the footman. "I ordered that, Fenya," Nikolay Sergeitch hastened to observe. "I wanted some fish. If you don't like it, ma chérie, don't let them serve it. I just ordered it." Fedosya Vassilyevna did not like dishes that she had not ordered herself, and now her eyes filled with tears. "Come, don't let us agitate ourselves," Mamikov, her household doctor, observed in a honeyed voice, just touching her arm with a smile as honeyed. "We are nervous enough as it is. Let us forget the brooch. Health is worth more than 2,000 roubles. "It's not the 2,000 I regret," answered the lady, and a big tear rolled down her cheek. "It's the fact itself that revolts me. I cannot put up with thieves in my house. I don't regret it. I regret nothing. But to steal from me is such ingratitude. That's how they repay me for my kindness." They all looked into their plates, but Mashenka fancied after the lady's words that every one was looking at her. A lump rose in her throat. She began crying and put her handkerchief to her lips. "Pardon," she muttered. "I can't help it. My head aches. I'll go away." And she got up from the table, scraping her chair awkwardly, and went out quickly, still more overcome with confusion. "It's beyond everything," said Nikolay Sergeitch, frowning. "What need was there to search her room? How out of place it was!" "I didn't say she took the brooch," said Fedosya Vassilyevna. "But can you answer for her? To tell the truth, I haven't much confidence in these learned paupers." "It really was unsuitable, Fenya. Excuse me, Fenya, but you've no kind of legal right to make a search." "I know nothing about your laws. All I know is that I've lost my brooch, and I will find the brooch." She brought her fork down on the plate with a clatter, and her eyes flashed angrily. "And you eat your dinner, and don't interfere in what doesn't concern you." Nikolay Sergeitch dropped his eyes mildly and sighed. Meanwhile, Mashenka, reaching her room, flung herself on her bed. She felt now neither alarm nor shame, but she felt an intense longing to go and slap the cheeks of this hard, arrogant, dull-witted, preposterous woman. Lying on her bed, she breathed into her pillow and dreamed of how nice it would be to go and buy the most expensive brooch and fling it into the face of this bullying woman. If only it were God's will that Fedosya Vassilyevna should come to ruin and wander about begging, and should taste all the horrors of poverty and dependence, and that Mashenka, whom she had insulted, might give her alms. Oh, if only she could come in for a big fortune, could buy a carriage, and could drive noisily past the windows, so as to be envied by that woman. But all these were only dreams. In reality, there was only one thing left to do: to get away as quickly as possible, not to stay another hour in this place. It was true that it was terrible to lose her place, to go back to her parents, who had nothing. But what could she do? Mashenka could not bear the sight of the lady of the house, nor of her little room. She felt stifled and wretched here. She was so disgusted with Fedosya Vassilyevna, who was so obsessed by her illnesses and her supposed aristocratic rank, that everything in the world seemed to have become coarse and unattractive because this woman was living in it. Mashenka jumped up from the bed and began packing. "May I come in?" asked Nikolay Sergeitch at the door. He had come up noiselessly to the door and spoke in a soft, subdued voice. "May I?" "Come in." He came in and stood still near the door. His eyes looked dim, and his red little nose was shiny. After dinner he used to drink beer, and the fact was perceptible in his walk, in his feeble, flabby hands. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to the basket. "I am packing. Forgive me, Nikolay Sergeitch, but I cannot remain in your house. I feel deeply insulted by this search." "I understand. Only you are wrong to go. Why should you? They've searched your things, but you... What does it matter to you? You will be none the worse for it." Mashenka was silent, and went on packing. Nikolay Sergeitch pinched his moustache as though wondering what he should say next, and went on in an ingratiating voice. "I understand, of course, but you must make allowances. You know my wife is nervous, headstrong. You mustn't judge her too harshly." Mashenka did not speak. "If you are so offended," Nikolai Sergeyitch went on, "well, if you like, I'm ready to apologize. I ask your pardon." Mashenka made no answer, but only bent lower over her box. This exhausted, irresolute man was of absolutely no significance in the household. He stood in the pitiful position of a dependent and hanger-on even with the servants, and his apology meant nothing either. You say nothing. That's not enough for you. In that case, I will apologize for my wife. In my wife's name. She behaved tactlessly, I admit it as a gentleman." Nikolai Sergeyitch walked about the room, heaved a sigh, and went on. "Then you want me to have it rankling here under my heart. You want my conscience to torment me." "I know it's not your fault, Nikolai Sergeyitch," said Mashenka, looking him full in the face with her big tear-stained eyes. "Why should you worry yourself?" "Of course, no. But still, don't you... Go away. I entreat you." Mashenka shook her head. Nikolai Sergeyitch stopped at the window and drummed on the pane with his finger-tips. "Such misunderstandings are simply torture to me," he said. "Why, do you want me to go down on my knees to you, or what? Your pride is wounded, and here you have been crying and packing up to go. But I have pride too, and you do not spare it. Or do you want me to tell you what I would not tell as confession? Do you? Listen, you want me to tell you what I won't tell the priest on my deathbed?" Mashenka made no answer. "I took my wife's brooch," Nikolai Sergeyitch said quickly. "Is that enough now? Are you satisfied? Yes, I took it. But, of course, I count on your discretion. For God's sake, not a word, not half a hint to any one." Mashenka, amazed and frightened, went on packing. She snatched her things, crumpled them up, and thrust them anyhow into the box and the basket. Now, after this candid avowal on the part of Nikolai Sergeyitch, she could not remain another minute, and could not understand how she could have gone on living in the house before. "And it's nothing to wonder at," Nikolai Sergeyitch went on after a pause. "It's an everyday story. I need money, and she won't give it to me. It was my father's money that bought this house and everything, you know. It's all mine, and the brooch belonged to my mother, and it's all mine. And she took it, took possession of everything. I can't go to law with her, you'll admit. I beg you most earnestly, overlook it, stay on. Tu comprends, tu pardonner. Will you stay?" "No," said Mashenka resolutely, beginning to tremble. "Let me alone, I entreat you." "Well, God bless you," sighed Nikolai Sergeyitch, sitting down on the stool near the box. "I must own I like people who still can feel resentment, contempt, and so on. I could sit here for ever and look at your indignant face. So you won't stay, then? I understand. It's bound to be so. Yes, of course. It's all right for you, but for me, whoa, ho, 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 I can't stir a step out of this cellar. I'd go off to one of our estates, but in every one of them there are some of my wife's rascals. Stewards, experts, damn them all. They mortgage and remortgage. You mustn't catch fish, must keep off the grass, mustn't break the trees. "Nikolai Sergeyitch!" His wife's voice called from the drawing-room. "Gina, call your master." "Then you won't stay?" asked Nikolai Sergeyitch, getting up quickly and going towards the door. "You might as well stay, really. In the evenings I could come and have a talk with you. Hey? Stay. If you go, there won't be a human face left in the house. It's awful." Nikolai Sergeyitch's pale, exhausted face besought her, but Mashenka shook her head, and with a wave of his hand he went out. Half an hour later
Chapter 4 of The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov, translated by Constance Garnett. Chapter 4. Ionitch, Part 1. When visitors to the provincial town S complained of the dreariness and monotony of life, the inhabitants of the town, as though defending themselves, declared that it was very nice in S. There was a library, a theatre, a club, that they had balls, and finally that there were clever, agreeable, and interesting families with whom one could make acquaintance. And they used to point to the family the Turkins as the most highly cultivated and talented. This family lived in their own house in the principal street near the governor's. Ivan Petrovitch Turkin, himself a stout, handsome, dark man with whiskers, used to get up amateur performances for benevolent objects, and used to take the part of an elderly general, and cough very amusingly. He knew a number of anecdotes, charades, proverbs, and was fond of being humorous and witty, and he always wore an expression from which it was impossible to tell whether he were joking or in earnest. His wife, Vera Iosifovna, a thin, nice-looking lady who wore a pince-nez, used to write novels and stories, and was very fond of reading them aloud to her visitors. The daughter, Ekaterina Ivanovna, a young girl, used to play on the piano. In short, every member of the family had a special talent. The Turkins welcomed visitors, and good-humouredly displayed their talents with genuine simplicity. Their stone house was roomy and cool in summer. Half of the windows looked into a shady old garden where nightingales used to sing in the spring. When there were visitors in the house, there was a clatter of knives in the kitchen and a smell of fried onions in the yard, and that was always a sure sign of a plentiful and savoury supper to follow. And as soon as Dmitri Ionitch Startsev was appointed the district doctor, and took up his abode at Jalij, 6 miles from S, he too was told that as a cultivated man it was essential for him to make the acquaintance of the Turkins. In the winter he was introduced to Ivan Petrovitch in the street. They talked about the weather, about the theatre, about the cholera. An invitation followed. On a holiday in the spring, it was Ascension Day, after seeing his patients, Startsev set off for town in search of a little recreation and to make some purchases. He walked in a leisurely way (he had not yet set up his carriage), humming all the time, "Before I'd drunk the tears from life's goblet." In town he dined, went for a walk in the gardens. Then Ivan Petrovitch's invitation came into his mind, as if it were of itself, and he decided to call on the Turkins and to see what sort of people they were. "How do you do, if you please?" said Ivan Petrovitch, meeting him on the steps. Delighted to see such an agreeable visitor. Come along, I will introduce you to my better half. I tell him, Verochka," he went on, as he presented the doctor to his wife, "I tell him that he has no right to sit at home in a hospital. He ought to devote his leisure to society, oughtn't he, darling?" "Sit here," said Vera Iosifovna, making her visitor sit down beside her. "You can dance attendance on me. My husband is jealous. He is an Othello, but we will try and behave so well that he will notice nothing." "Ha, you spoilt chicken!" Ivan Petrovitch muttered tenderly, and he kissed her on the forehead. "You have come just in the nick of time," he said, addressing the doctor again. "My better half has written the hugest novel, and she is going to read it aloud to-day." "Petit Jean,"
said Vera Iosifovna to her husband. Dites que l'on nous donne du thé. Startsev was introduced to Ekaterina Ivanovna, a girl of 18, very much like her mother, thin and pretty. Her expression was still childish, and her figure was soft and slim, and her developed girlish bosom, healthy and beautiful, was suggestive of spring, real spring. Then they drank tea with jam, honey, and sweetmeats, and with very nice cakes which melted in the mouth. As the evening came on, other visitors gradually arrived, and Ivan Petrovitch fixed his laughing eyes on each of them and said, "How do you do, if you please?" Then they all sat down in the drawing-room with very serious faces, and Vera Iosifovna read her novel. It began like this: "The frost was intense." The windows were wide open. From the kitchen came the clatter of knives and the smell of fried onions. It was comfortable in the soft, deep armchair. The lights had such a friendly twinkle in the twilight of the drawing-room, and at the moment, on a summer evening when sounds of voices and laughter floated in from the streets, and whiffs of lilac from the yard, it was difficult to grasp that the frost was intense, and that the setting sun was lighting with its chilly rays a solitary wayfarer on the snowy plain. Vera Iosifovna read how a beautiful young countess founded a school, a hospital, a library in her village, and fell in love with a wandering artist. She read of what never happens in real life, and yet it was pleasant to listen. It was comfortable, and such agreeable, serene thoughts kept coming into the mind, one had no desire to get up. "Not badsome," Ivan Petrovitch said softly, and one of the visitors, hearing, with his thoughts far away, said hardly audibly, "Yes, truly." 1 hour passed, another. In the town gardens close by a band was playing and a chorus was singing. When Vera Iosifovna shut her manuscript book, the company was silent for 5 minutes, listening to Lutchina being sung by the chorus, and the song gave what was not in the novel and is in real life. "Do you publish your stories in magazines?" Startsev asked Vera Iosifovna. "No," she answered, "I never publish. I write it and put it away in my cupboard. Why publish?" she explained. "We have enough to live on." And for some reason every one sighed. "And now, kitten, you play something," Ivan Petrovitch said to his daughter. The lid of the piano was raised, and the music, lying ready, was opened. Ekaterina Ivanovna sat down and banged on the piano with both hands, and then banged again with all her might, and then again and again. Her shoulders and bosom shook. She obstinately banged on the same notes, and it sounded as if she would not leave off until she had hammered the keys into the piano. The drawing-room was filled with the din. Everything was resounding, the floor, the ceiling, the furniture. Ekaterina Ivanovna was playing a difficult passage, interesting simply on account of its difficulty, long and monotonous, and Startsev, listening, pictured stones dropping down a steep hill and going on dropping, and he wished they would leave off dropping. And at the same time Ekaterina Ivanovna, rosy from the violent exercise, strong and vigorous, with a lock of hair falling over her forehead, attracted him very much. After the winter spent at Jalij among patients and peasants, to sit in a drawing-room to watch this young, elegant, and in all probability pure creature, and to listen to these noisy, tedious, but still cultured sounds, was so pleasant, so novel. "Well, kitten, you have played as never before," said Ivan Petrovitch, with tears in his eyes, when his daughter had finished and stood up. "Die, Denise! You won't write anything better." All flocked round her, congratulated her, expressed astonishment, declared that it was long since they had heard such music, and she listened in silence with a faint smile, and her whole figure was expressive of triumph. "Superb! Superb!" "Splendid!" said Startsev, too, carried away by the general enthusiasm. "Where have you studied?" he asked Ekaterina Ivanovna. "At the Conservatoire?" "No, I am only preparing for the Conservatoire, and till now have been working with Madame Zavlovsky." "Have you finished at the high school here?" "Oh, no," Vera Iosifovna answered for her. "We have teachers for her at home. There might be bad influences at the high school or a boarding school, you know. While a young girl is growing up, she ought to be under no influence but her mother's." "All the same, I'm going to the Conservatoire," said Ekaterina Ivanovna. "No, Kitten loves her mamma. Kitten won't grieve papa and mamma." "No, I'm going, said Ekaterina Ivanovna, with playful caprice and stamping her foot. And at supper it was Ivan Petrovitch who displayed his talents. Laughing only with his eyes, he told anecdotes, made epigrams, asked ridiculous riddles, and answered them himself, talking the whole time in his extraordinary language, evolved in the course of prolonged practice in witticism, and evidently now become a habit. "Badsome, hugeous, thank you most dumbly," and so on. But that was not all. When the guests, replete and satisfied, trooped into the hall, looking for their coats and sticks, there bustled about them the footman, Pavlusha, or, as he was called in the family, Pava, a lad of 14, with shaven head and chubby cheeks. "Come, Pava, perform," Ivan Petrovitch said to him. Pava struck an attitude, flung up his arm, and said in a tragic tone, "Unhappy woman, die!" And every one roared with laughter. "It's entertaining," thought Startsev as he went out into the street. He went to a restaurant and drank some beer, then set off to walk home to Dyalizh. He walked all the way singing, "Thy voice to me so languid and caressing." On going to bed he felt not the slightest fatigue after the 6 miles' walk. On the contrary, he felt as though he could with pleasure have walked another 20. Not badsome, he thought, and laughed as he fell asleep. II. Startsev kept meaning to go to the Turkins' again, but there was a great deal of work in the hospital, and he was unable to find free time. In this way more than a year passed in work and solitude, but one day a letter in a light blue envelope was brought to him from the town. Vera Iosifovna had been suffering for some time from migraine, but now, since Kitten frightened her every day by saying that she was going away to the Conservatoire, the attacks began to be more frequent. All the doctors of the town had been at the Turkins'. At last it was the district doctor's turn. Vera Iosifovna wrote him a touching letter in which she begged him to come and relieve her sufferings. Startsev went, and after that he began to be often, very often, at the Turkins'. He really did something for Vera Iosifovna, and she was already telling all her visitors that he was a wonderful and exceptional doctor. But it was not for the sake of her migraine that he visited the Turkins' now. It was a holiday. Ekaterina Ivanovna finished her long, wearisome exercises on the piano. Then they sat a long time in the dining-room, drinking tea, and Ivan Petrovitch told some amusing story. Then there was a ring, and he had to go into the hall to welcome a guest. Startsev took advantage of the momentary commotion and whispered to Ekaterina Ivanovna in great agitation. For God's sake, I entreat you, don't torment me. Let us go into the garden." She shrugged her shoulders, as though perplexed and not knowing what he wanted of her, but she got up and went. "You play the piano for 3 or 4 hours," he said, following her. "Then you sit with your mother, and there is no possibility of speaking to you. Give me a quarter of an hour at least, I beseech you." Autumn was approaching, and it was quiet and melancholy in the old garden. The dark leaves lay thick in the walls. It was already beginning to get dark early. "I haven't seen you for a whole week," Startsev went on, "and if you only knew what suffering it is. Let us sit down. Listen to me." They had a favourite place in the garden, a seat under an old spreading maple, and now they sat down on this seat. "What do you want?" said Ekaterina Ivanovna dryly, in a matter-of-fact tone. "I have not seen you for a whole week. I have not heard you for so long. I long passionately. I thirst for your voice. Speak." She fascinated him by her freshness, the naïve expression of her eyes and cheeks. Even in the way her dress hung on her, he saw something extraordinarily charming, touching in its simplicity and naïve grace, and at the same time, in spite of this naïveté, she seemed to him intelligent and developed beyond her years. He could talk with her about literature, about art, about anything he liked, could complain to her of life, of people, though it sometimes happened, in the middle of a serious conversation, she would laugh inappropriately or run away into the house. Like almost all girls of her neighbourhood, she had read a great deal. As a rule, people read very little in S., and at the lending library they said, if it were not for the girls and the young Jews, they might as well shut up the library. This afforded Startsev infinite delight. He used to ask her eagerly every time what she had been reading the last few days, and listened enthralled while she told him. "What have you been reading this week since I saw you last?" he asked now. "Do please tell me." "I have been reading Pisemsky." "What exactly?" "1,000 Souls," answered Kitten. "And what a funny name Pisemsky had! Alexey Filofilatkitch." "Where are you going?" cried Startsev in horror, as she suddenly got up and walked toward the house. "I must talk to you. I want to explain myself. Stay with me just 5 minutes, I supplicate you." She stopped, as though she wanted to say something, then awkwardly thrust a note into his hand, ran home and sat down to the piano again. "Be in the cemetery," Startsev read, "at 11 o'clock tonight, near the tomb of Dmitri." "Well, that's not at all clever," he thought, coming to himself. "Why the cemetery? What for?" It was clear Kitten was playing a prank. Who would seriously dream of making an appointment at night in the cemetery, far out of the town, when it might have been arranged in the street or in the town gardens? And was it in keeping with him, a district doctor, an intelligent, staid man, to be sighing, receiving notes to hang about cemeteries, to do silly things that even schoolboys think ridiculous nowadays? What would this romance lead to? What would his colleagues say when they heard of it? Such were Startsev's reflections as he wandered round the tables at the club, and at 10:30 he suddenly set off for the cemetery. By now he had his own pair of horses and a coachman called Panteleimon in a velvet waistcoat. The moon was shining, it was still warm, warm as it is in autumn. Dogs were howling in the suburb near the slaughter-house. Startsev left his horses in one of the side streets at the end of the town and walked on foot to the cemetery. We all have our oddities, he thought. Kitten is odd too, and who knows? Perhaps she is not joking. Perhaps she will come. And he abandoned himself to this faint, vain hope, and it intoxicated him. He walked for half a mile through the fields. The cemetery showed as a dark streak in the distance. like a forest or a big garden. The wall of white stone came into sight, the gate. In the moonlight he could read on the gate, "The hour cometh." Startsev went in at the little gate, and before anything else he saw the white crosses and monuments on both sides of the broad avenue, and the black shadows of them and the poplars, and for a long way round it was all white and black, and the slumbering trees bowed their branches over the white stones. It seemed as though it were lighter here than in the fields. The maple leaves stood out sharply like paws on the yellow sand of the avenue and on the stones, and the inscriptions on the tombs could be clearly read. For the first moments Startsev was struck now by what he saw for the first time in his life, and what he would probably never see again. A world not like anything else, a world in which the moonlight was as soft and beautiful, as though slumbering here in its cradle, where there was no life, none whatever, but in every dark poplar, in every tomb, there was felt the presence of a mystery that promised a life peaceful, beautiful, eternal. The stones and faded flowers, together with the autumn scent of the leaves, all told of forgiveness, melancholy, and peace. All was silent around. The stars looked down from the sky in the profound stillness, and Startsev's footsteps sounded loud and out of place, and only when the church clock began striking, and he imagined himself dead, buried there forever, he felt as though some one were looking at him. And for a moment he thought that it was not peace and tranquillity, but stifled despair, the dumb dreariness of non-existence. Dmitri's tomb was in the form of a shrine with an angel at the top. The Italian opera had once visited S, and one of the singers had died. She had been buried here, and this monument put up to her. No one in the town remembered her, but the lamp at the entrance reflected the moonlight and looked as though it were burning. There was no one, and indeed who would come here at midnight? But Startsev waited, and as though the moonlight warmed his passion, he waited passionately, and in imagination pictured kisses and embraces. He sat near the monument for half an hour, then paced up and down the side avenues with his hat in his hand, waiting and thinking of the many women and girls buried in these tombs who had been beautiful and fascinating, who had loved, at night burned with passion, yielding themselves to caresses. How wickedly Mother Nature jested at man's expense after all! How humiliating it was to recognize it! Startsev thought this, and at the same time he wanted to cry out that he wanted love, that he was eager for it at all costs. To his eyes they were not slabs of marble, but fair white bodies in the moonlight. He saw shapes hiding bashfully in the shadows of the trees, felt their warmth, and the languor was oppressive. And as though a curtain were lowered, the moon went behind a cloud, and suddenly all was darkness. Startsev could scarcely find the gate. By now it was as dark as it is on an autumn night. Then he wandered about for an hour and a half, looking for the side street in which he had left his horses. "I am tired, I can scarcely stand on my legs," he said to Panteleimon, and settling himself with relief in his carriage, he thought, "Ach, I ought not to get fat." 3. The following evening he went to the Turkins to make an offer, but it turned out to be an inconvenient moment, as Ekaterina Ivanovna was in her own room having her hair done by a hairdresser. She was getting ready to go to a dance at the club. He had to sit a long time again in the dining-room, drinking tea. Ivan Petrovitch, seeing that his visitor was bored and preoccupied, drew some notes out of his waistcoat pocket, read a funny letter from a German steward saying that all the ironmongery was ruined and the plasticity was peeling off the walls. "I expect they will give a decent dowry," thought Startsev, listening absent-mindedly. After a sleepless night he found himself in a state of stupefaction, as though he had been given something sweet and soporific to drink. There was fog in his soul, but joy and warmth, and at the same time a sort of cold, heavy fragment of his brain was reflecting, "Stop it before it is too late. Is she the match for you? She is spoilt, whimsical, sleeps till 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while you are a deacon's son, a district doctor. What of it?" he thought. "I don't care. Besides, if you marry her," the fragment went on, "then her relations will make you give up the district work and live in the town. After all," he thought, "if it must be the town it must be. They will give him a dowry. We can establish ourselves suitably." At last Ekaterina Ivanovna came in, dressed for the ball, with a low neck, looking fresh and pretty, and Startsev admired her so much and went into such ecstasies that he could say nothing, but simply stared at her and laughed. She began saying good-bye, and he had no reason for staying now, got up, saying that it was time for him to go home. His patients were waiting for him. "Well, there's no help for that," said Ivan Petrovitch. "Go, and you might take Kitten to the club on the way." It was spotting with rain, it was very dark, and they could only tell where the horses were by Panteleymon's husky cough. The hood of the carriage was put up. "I stand upright, you lie down right, he lies all right," said Ivan Petrovitch as he put his daughter into the carriage. They drove off. "I was at the cemetery yesterday," Startsev began. "How ungenerous and merciless it was on your part." "You went to the cemetery?" "Yes, I went there and waited almost till 2 o'clock. I suffered." "Well, suffer, if you cannot understand a joke." Ekaterina Ivanovna, pleased at having so cleverly taken in a man who was in love with her, and at being the object of such intense love, burst out laughing, and suddenly uttered a shriek of terror, for at that very minute the horses turned sharply in at the gate of the club, and the carriage almost tilted over. Startsev put his arm round Ekaterina Ivanovna's waist. In her fright she nestled up to him, and he could not restrain himself, and passionately kissed her on the lips and on the chin, and hugged her more tightly. "That's enough," she said drily. And a minute later she was not in the carriage, and a policeman near the lighted entrance of the club shouted in a detestable voice to Panteleimon, "What are you stopping for, you crow? Drive on!" Startsev drove home, but soon afterwards returned. Attired in another man's dress suit and a stiff white tie which kept sawing at his neck and trying to slip away from the collar, he was sitting at midnight in the club drawing-room, and was saying with enthusiasm to Ekaterina Ivanovna, "Ah, how little people know who have never loved! It seems to me that no one has ever yet written of love truly, and I doubt whether this tender, joyful, agonizing feeling can be described, and any one who has once experienced it will not attempt to put it into words. What is the use of preliminaries and introductions? What is the use of unnecessary fine words? My love is immeasurable. I beg, beseech you," Startsev brought out at last, "be my wife." "Dmitri Ionitch," said Ekaterina Ivanovna, with a very grave face, after a moment's thought. "Dmitri Ionitch, I am very grateful to you for the honour. I respect you, but..." She got up and continued standing. "But forgive me, I cannot be your wife. Let us talk seriously. Dmitri Ionitch, you know I love art beyond everything in life. I adore music. I love it frantically. I have dedicated my whole life to it. I want to be an artist. I want fame, success, freedom. And you want me to go on living in this town, to go on living this empty, useless life which has become insufferable to me. To become a wife? Oh, no, forgive me. One must strive towards a lofty, glorious goal, and married life would put me in bondage for ever, Dmitri Ionitch." She faintly smiled, as she pronounced his name, she thought of Alexey Feofilaktich. "Dmitri Ionitch, you are a good, clever, honourable man. You are better than any one." Tears came into her eyes. "I feel for you with my whole heart, but you will understand." And she turned away and went out of the drawing-room to prevent herself from crying. Startsev's heart left off throbbing uneasily. Going out of the club into the street, he first of all tore off the stiff tie and drew a deep breath. He was a little ashamed, and his vanity was wounded. He had not expected a refusal, and could not believe that all his dreams, his hopes and yearnings had led him up to such a stupid end, just as in some little play at an amateur performance. And he was sorry for his feeling, for that love of his, so sorry that he felt as though he could have burst into sobs or have violently belaboured Panteleymon's broad back with his umbrella. For 3 days he could not get on with anything. He could not eat nor sleep. But when the news reached him that Ekaterina Ivanovna had gone away to Moscow to enter the conservatoire, he grew calmer and lived as before. Afterwards, remembering sometimes how he had wandered about the cemetery, or how he had driven all over the town to get a dress suit, he stretched lazily and said, "What a lot of trouble, though." 4. 4 years had passed. Startsev already had a large practice in the town. Every morning he hurriedly saw his patients at Gyalizh, then he drove in to see his town patients. By now he drove, not with a pair, but with a team of 3 with bells on them, and he returned home late at night. He had grown broader and stouter, and was not very fond of walking, as he was somewhat asthmatic. And Panteleimon had grown stout too, and the broader he grew, the more mournfully he sighed and complained of his hard luck. He was sick of driving. Startsev used to visit various households and met many people, but did not become intimate with any one. The inhabitants irritated him by their conversation, their views of life, and even their appearance. Experience taught him, by degrees, that while he played cards or lunched with one of these people, the man was a peaceful, friendly, and even intelligent human being, that as soon as one talked of anything not eatable, for instance of politics or science, he would be completely at a loss, or would expound a philosophy so stupid and ill-natured that there was nothing else to do but wave one's hand in despair and go away. Even when Startsev tried to talk to liberal citizens, saying, for instance, that humanity, thank God, was progressing, and that one day it would be possible to dispense with passports and capital punishment, the liberal citizen would look at him askance and ask him mistrustfully, "Then anyone could murder anyone he chose in the open street." And when at tea or supper Startsev observed in company that one should work, that one ought not to live without working, every one took this as a reproach, and began to get angry and argue aggressively. With all that, the inhabitants did nothing, absolutely nothing, and took no interest in anything, and it was quite impossible to think of anything to say. And Startsev avoided conversation, and confined himself to eating and playing vint, and when there was a family festival in some household, and he was invited to a meal, then he sat and ate in silence, looking at his plate. And everything that was said at the time was uninteresting, unjust, and stupid. He felt irritated and disturbed, but held his tongue, and because he sat glumly silent and looked at his plate, he was nicknamed in the town the haughty Pole, though he had never been a Pole. All such entertainments as theatres and concerts he declined, but he played vint every evening for 3 hours with enjoyment. He had another diversion, to which he took imperceptibly, Little by little, in the evening he would take out of his pockets the notes he had gained by his practice, and sometimes there were stuffed in his pockets notes yellow and green, and smelling of scent and vinegar and incense and fish oil, up to the value of 70 roubles, and when they amounted to some hundreds, he took them to the Mutual Credit Bank and deposited the money there to his account. He was only twice at the Turkins' in the course of the 4 years after Ekaterina Ivanovna had gone away, on each occasion at the invitation of Vera Iosifovna, who was still undergoing treatment for migraine. Every summer Ekaterina Ivanovna came to stay with her parents, but he did not once see her. It somehow never happened. But now 4 years had passed. One still, warm morning a letter was brought to the hospital. Vera Iosifovna wrote to Dmitri Ionitch that she was missing him very much, and begged him to come and see them, and to relieve her sufferings, and, by the way, it was her birthday. Below was a postscript: "I join in my mother's request. K." Startsev considered, and in the evening he went to the Turkins'. "How do you do, if you please?" Ivan Petrovitch met him, smiling with his eyes only. "Bonjour!" Vera Iosifovna, white-haired and looking much older, shook Startsev's hand, sighed affectionately, and said: "You don't care to pay attentions to me, doctor. You never come and see us. I am too old for you. But now some one young has come, perhaps she will be more fortunate." And Kitten? She had grown thinner, paler, had grown handsomer and more graceful. But now she was Ekaterina Ivanovna, not Kitten. She had lost the freshness and look of childish naivete, and in her expression and manners there was something new, guilty and diffident, as though she did not feel herself at home here in the Turkins' house. "How many summers, how many winters," she said, giving Startsev her hand, and he could see that her heart was beating with excitement. And looking at him intently and curiously, she went on: "How much stouter you are! You look sunburnt and more manly, but on the whole you have changed very little." Now, too, he thought her attractive, very attractive, but there was something lacking in her, or else something superfluous. He could not himself have said exactly what it was, but something prevented him from feeling as before. He did not like her pallor, her new expression, her faint smile, her voice, and soon afterwards he disliked her clothes too, the low chair in which she was sitting. He disliked something in the past, when he had almost married her. He thought of his love, of the dreams and the hopes which had troubled him 4 years before, and he felt awkward. They had tea with cakes. Then Vera Iosifovna read aloud a novel. She read of things that never happen in real life, and Startsev listened, looked at her handsome grey head, and waited for her to finish. People are not stupid because they can't write novels, but because they can't conceal it when they do, he thought. "Not badsome," said Ivan Petrovitch. Then Ekaterina Ivanovna played long and noisily on the piano, and when she finished she was profusely thanked and warmly praised. "It's a good thing I did not marry her," thought Startsev. She looked at him and evidently expected him to ask her to go into the garden, but he remained silent. "Let's have a talk," she said, going up to him. "How are you getting on? What are you doing? How are things? I have been thinking about you all these days," she went on nervously. "I wanted to write to you. I wanted to come myself to see you at Jalizh. I quite made up my mind to go, but afterwards I thought better of it. God knows what your attitude is towards me now. I have been looking forward to seeing you to-day with such emotion. For goodness' sake, let us go into the garden." They went into the garden, and sat down on the seat under the old maple, just as they had done 4 years before. It was dark. "How are you getting on?" asked Ekaterina Ivanovna. "Oh, all right. I'm jogging along," answered Startsev. And he could think of nothing more. They were silent. "I feel so excited," said Ekaterina Ivanovna, and she hid her face in her hands. "But don't pay attention to it. I am so happy to be at home. I am so glad to see everyone. I can't get used to it. So many memories. I thought we should talk without stopping till morning." Now he saw her face near, her shining eyes, and in the darkness she looked younger than in the room, and even her old childish expression seemed to have come back to her. And indeed she was looking at him with naive curiosity, as though she wanted to get a closer view and understanding of the man who had loved her so ardently, with such tenderness, and so unsuccessfully. Her eyes thanked him for that love, and he remembered all that had been, every minute detail, how he had wandered about the cemetery, how he had returned home in the morning, exhausted, and he suddenly felt sad and regretted the past. A warmth began glowing in his heart. "Do you remember how I took you to the dance at the club?" he asked. "It was dark and rainy then." The warmth was glowing now in his heart, and he longed to talk, to rail at life. "Ech!" he said with a sigh. "You ask how I am living. How do we live here? Why, not at all. We grow old, we grow stout, we go slack. Day after day passes, life slips by without colour, without expression, without thoughts. In the daytime working for gain, and in the evening the club, the company of card-players, alcoholic, raucous-voiced gentlemen whom I can't endure. What is there nice in it?" "Well, you have work, a noble object in life. You used to be so fond of talking of your hospital. I was such a queer girl then. I imagined myself such a great pianist. Nowadays all young ladies play the piano, and I played too, like everybody else. There was nothing special about me. I am just such a pianist as my mother is an authoress. And of course I didn't understand you then, but afterwards in Moscow I often thought of you. I thought of no one but you. What happiness to be a district doctor, to help the suffering, to be serving the people! What happiness!" Ekaterina Ivanovna repeated with enthusiasm. "When I thought of you in Moscow, you seemed to me so ideal, so lofty." Startsev thought of the notes he used to take out of his pockets in the evening with such pleasure, and the glow in his heart was quenched. He got up to go into the house. She took his arm. "You are the best man I've known in my life," she went on. "We will see each other and talk, won't we? Promise me. I am not a pianist. I am not in error about myself now, and I will not play before you or talk of music." When they had gone into the house, and when Startsev saw in the lamplight her face, and her sad, grateful, searching eyes fixed upon him, he felt uneasy and thought again: "It's a good thing I did not marry her then." He began taking leave. "You have no human right to go before supper," said Ivan Petrovitch as he saw him off. "It's extremely perpendicular on your part. Well, now, perform," he added, addressing Pava in the hall. Pava, no longer a boy, but a young man with moustaches, threw himself into an attitude, flung up his arm, and said in a tragic voice: "Unhappy woman, die!" All this irritated Startsev. Getting into his carriage and looking at the dark house and garden which had once been so precious and so dear, he thought of everything at once: Vera Iosifovna's novels, and Kitten's noisy playing, Ivan Petrovitch's jokes, and Pava's tragic posturing, and thought if the most talented people in the town were so futile, what must the town be? 3 days later Pavel brought a letter from Ekaterina Ivanovna. "You don't come and see us. Why?" she wrote to him. "I am afraid that you have changed toward us. I am afraid, and I am terrified at the very thought of it. Reassure me. Come and tell me that everything is well. I must talk to you. Your E.I." He read this letter, thought a moment, and said to Pavel, "Tell them, my good fellow, that I can't come to-day. I am very busy. Say I will come in 3 days or so." But 3 days passed, a week passed, he still did not go. Happening once to drive past the Turkin's house, he thought he must go in, if only for a moment, but on second thoughts did not go in. And he never went to the Turkins again. 5. Several more years have passed. Startsev has grown stouter still, has grown corpulent, breathes heavily, and already walks with his head thrown back. When stout and red in the face, he drives with his bells and his team of 3 horses, and Panteleimon, also stout and red in the face, with his thick beefy neck, sits on the box, holding his arms stiffly out before him as though they were made of wood, and shouts to those he meets, "Keep to the right!" It is an impressive picture. One might think it was not a mortal, but some heathen deity in his chariot. He has an immense practice in the town, no time to breathe, and already has an estate and 2 houses in the town, and he is looking out for a 3rd more profitable. And when at the Mutual Credit Bank he is told of a house that is for sale, he goes to the house without ceremony, and marching through all the rooms, regardless of the half-dressed women and children who gaze at him in amazement and alarm, he prods at the doors with his stick and says, "Is that the study? Is that a bedroom? And what's here?" And as he does, he breathes heavily and wipes the sweat from his brow. He has a great deal to do, but still he does not give up his work as district doctor. He is greedy for gain, and he tries to be in all places at once. At Jalij and in the town he is simply called Ionitch. "Where is Ionitch off to?" Or should we not call in Ionitch to a consultation? Perhaps because his throat is covered with rolls of fat, his voice has changed. It has become thin and sharp. His temper has changed too. He has grown ill-humoured and irritable. When he sees his patients, he is usually out of temper. He impatiently taps the floor with his stick and shouts in his disagreeable voice, "Be good as to confine yourself to answering my questions. Don't talk so much." He is solitary. He leads a dreary life. Nothing interests him. During all the years he had lived at Jalij, his love for Kitten had been his one joy, and probably his last. In the evenings he plays vint at the club, and then sits alone at a big table and has supper. Ivan, the oldest and most respectable of the waiters, serves him, hands him Lafitte No. 17, and every one at the club, the members of the committee, the cook and waiters, know what he likes and what he doesn't like, and do their very utmost to satisfy him, or else he is sure to fly into a rage and bang on the floor with his stick. As he eats his supper he turns round from time to time and puts in his spoke in some conversation. "What are you talking about, eh? Whom?" And when at a neighbouring table there is talk of the Turkins, he asks, "What Turkins are you speaking of? Do you mean the people whose daughter plays on the piano?" That is all that can be said about him. And the Turkins? Ivan Petrovitch has grown no older. He is not changed in the least, and still makes jokes and tells anecdotes as of old. Vera Iosifovna still reads her novels aloud to her visitors with eagerness and touching simplicity, and Kitten plays the piano for 4 hours every day. She has grown visibly older, is constantly ailing, and every autumn goes to the Crimea with her mother. When Ivan Petrovitch sees them off at the station, he wipes his tears as the train starts and shouts, "Good-bye, if you please," and he waves his handkerchief. Chapter 5 of The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett. Chapter 5. The Head of the Family. It is, as a rule, after losing heavily at cards, or after a drinking bout, when an attack of dyspepsia is setting in, that Stepan Stepanitch Zhilin wakes up in an exceptionally gloomy frame of mind. He looks sour, rumpled, and dishevelled. There is an expression of displeasure on his grey face, as though he were offended or disgusted by something. He dresses slowly, sips his Vichy water deliberately, and begins walking about the rooms. "I should like to know what beast comes in here and does not shut the door," he grumbles angrily, wrapping his dressing-gown about him and spitting loudly. "Take away that paper. Why is it lying about here? We keep 20 servants, and the place is more untidy than a pothouse. Who was that ringing? Who the devil is that?" "That's Anfisa, the midwife, who brought our Fedya into the world," answers his wife. "Always hanging about, those cadging toadies." "There's no making you out, Stepan Stepanitch. You asked her yourself, and now you scold." "I'm not scolding. I am speaking. You might find something to do, my dear, instead of sitting with your hands in your lap, trying to pick a quarrel. Upon my word, women are beyond my comprehension. Beyond my comprehension. How can they waste whole days doing nothing? A man works like an ox, like a beast, while his wife, the partner of his life, sits like a pretty doll, sits and does nothing but watch for an opportunity to quarrel with her husband by way of diversion. It's time to drop these schoolgirlish ways, my dear. You are not a schoolgirl, not a young lady. You are a wife and a mother. You turn away? Ah! It's not agreeable to listen to the bitter truth." "It's strange that you only speak the bitter truth when your liver is out of order." "That's right. Get up a scene." "Have you been out late, or playing cards?" "What if I have? Is that anybody's business? Am I obliged to give an account of my doings to any one? It's my own money I lose, I suppose. What I spend, as well as what is spent in this house, belongs to me. Me, do you hear? To me." And so on, all in the same style, but at no other time is Stepan Stepanitch so reasonable, virtuous, stern, or just as at dinner, when all his household are sitting about him. It usually begins with the soup. After swallowing the first spoonful, Zhilin suddenly frowns and puts down his spoon. "Damn it all!" he mutters. "I shall have to dine at a restaurant, I suppose." "What's wrong?" asked his wife anxiously. "Isn't the soup good?" "One must have the taste of a pig to eat hogwash like that. There's too much salt in it. It smells of dirty rags, more like bugs than onions. It's simply revolting, Anfisa Ivanovna," he says, addressing the midwife. "Every day I give no end of money for housekeeping. I deny myself everything, and this is what they provide for my dinner. I suppose they want me to give up the office and go into the kitchen to do some cooking myself." "The soup is very good to-day," the governess ventures timidly. "Oh, you think so?" says Zhilin, looking at her angrily from under his eyelids. "Every one to his taste, of course. It must be confessed our tastes are very different, Varvara Vassilievna. You, for instance, are satisfied with the behaviour of this boy." Zhilin, with a tragic gesture, points to his son Fedya. "You are delighted with him, while I am disgusted, yes." Fedya, a boy of 7, with a pale, sickly face, leaves off eating and drops his eyes. His face grows paler still. "Yes, you are delighted, and I am disgusted. Which of us is right, I cannot say, but I venture to think, as his father, I know my own son better than you do. Look how he is sitting. Is that the way decently brought-up children sit? Sit properly." Fedya tilts his chin up, cranes his neck, and fancies that he is holding himself better. Tears come into his eyes. "Eat your dinner. Hold your spoon properly. You wait. I'll show you, you horrid boy. Don't dare to whimper. Look straight at me." Fedya tries to look straight at him, but his face is quivering and his eyes filled with tears. "Ah, you cry. You're naughty, and then you cry. Go stand in the corner, you beast." "But let him have his dinner first," his wife intervenes. "No dinner for him. Such rascals don't deserve dinner." Fedya, wincing and quivering all over, creeps down from his chair and goes into the corner. "You won't get off with that," his parent persists. "If nobody else cares to look after your bringing up, so be it. I must begin. I won't let you be naughty and cry at dinner, my lad. Idiot! You must do your duty. Do you understand? Do your duty. Your father works, and you must work too. No one must eat the bread of idleness. You must be a man, a man." "For God's sake, leave off," says his wife in French. "Don't nag at us before outsiders, at least. The old woman is all ears, and now, thanks to her, all the town will hear of it." "I am not afraid of outsiders," answers Zhilin in Russian. "Anfisa Ivanovna sees that I am speaking the truth. Why do you think I ought to be pleased with the boy? Do you know what he costs me? Do you know what he costs me? Do you know, you nasty boy, what you cost me? Or do you imagine that I coin money, that I get it for nothing? Don't howl. Hold your tongue. Do you hear what I say? Do you want me to whip you, you young ruffian?" Fedya wails aloud and begins to sob. "This is insufferable," said his mother, getting up from the table and flinging down her dinner napkin. "You never let us have dinner in peace. Your bread sticks in my throat." And putting her handkerchief to her eyes, she walks out of the dining-room. "Now she is offended," grumbles Zhilin with a forced smile. "She's been spoilt. That's how it is, Anfisa Ivanovna. No one likes to hear the truth nowadays. It's all my fault, it seems." Several minutes of silence follow. Zhilin looks around at the plates, and noticing that no one has yet touched their soup, heaves a deep sigh and stares at the flushed and uneasy face of the governess. "Why don't you eat, Varvara Vassilievna?" he asked. "Offended, I suppose. I see. You don't like to be told the truth. You must forgive me, it's my nature. I can't be a hypocrite. I always blurt out the plain truth. But I notice that my presence is unwelcome. No one can eat or talk while I am here. Well, you should have told me, and I would have gone away. I will go." Zhilin gets up and walks with dignity to the door, As he passes the weeping Fedya, he stops.
"After all that has passed here, you are free,"
he says to Fedya, throwing back his head with dignity.
"I won't meddle in your bringing up again. I wash my hands of it. I humbly apologize that as a father, from a sincere desire for your welfare, I have disturbed you and your mentors. At the same time, once for all, I disclaim all responsibility for your future."
Fedya wails and sobs more loudly than ever. Zhilin turns with dignity to the door and departs to his bedroom. When he wakes from his after-dinner nap, he begins to feel the stings of conscience. He is ashamed to face his wife, his son, Anfisa Ivanovna, and even feels very wretched when he recalls the scene at dinner. But his amour-propre is too much for him. He has not the manliness to be frank, and he goes on sulking and grumbling. Waking up next morning, he feels in excellent spirits, and whistles gaily as he washes. Going into the dining-room to breakfast, he finds there Fedya, who at the sight of his father gets up and looks at him helplessly.
"Well, young man," Zhilin greets him good-humouredly, sitting down to the table, "what have you got to tell me, young man? Are you all right? Well, come, Chubby, give your father a kiss."
With a pale, grave face, Fedya goes up to his father and touches his Chapter 6 of The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett. Chapter 6. Volodya. At 5 o'clock one Sunday afternoon in summer, Volodya, a plain, shy, sickly-looking lad of 17, was sitting in the arbour of the Shumichins' country villa, feeling dreary. His despondent thought flowed in 3 directions. In the first place, he had next day, Monday, an examination in mathematics. He knew that if he did not get through the written examination on the morrow, he would be expelled, for he had already been 2 years in the 6th form, and had 2 3/4 marks for algebra in his annual report. In the second place, his presence at the villa of the Shumichins, a wealthy family with aristocratic pretensions, was a continual source of mortification to his amour-propre. It seemed to him that Madame Shumichin looked upon him and his maman as poor relations and dependents, that they laughed at his maman and did not respect her. He had on one occasion accidentally overheard Madame Shumichin on the veranda telling her cousin Anna Fyodorovna that his maman still tried to look young and got herself up, that she never paid her losses at cards, and had a partiality for other people's shoes and tobacco. Every day Volodya besought his maman not to go to the Shumichins, and drew a picture of the humiliating part she played with these gentle folk. He tried to persuade her, said rude things, but she, a frivolous, pampered woman, who had run through 2 fortunes, her own and her husband's, in her time, and always gravitated toward acquaintances of high rank, did not understand him, and twice a week Volodya had to accompany her to the villa he hated. In the third place, the youth could not for one instant get rid of a strange, unpleasant feeling which was absolutely new to him. It seemed to him that he was in love with Anna Fyodorovna, the Shumihin's cousin who was staying with them. She was a vivacious, loud-voiced, laughter-loving, healthy and vigorous lady of 30, with rosy cheeks, plump shoulders, a plump round chin, and a continual smile on her thin lips. She was neither young nor beautiful. Volodya knew that perfectly well, but for some reason he could not help thinking of her, looking at her while she shrugged her plump shoulders and moved her flat back as she played croquet, or after prolonged laughter and running up and down stairs sank into a low chair, and half closing her eyes and gasping for breath, pretended that she was stifling and could not breathe. She was married. Her husband, a staid and dignified architect, came once a week to the villa, slept soundly, and returned to town. Volodya's strange feeling had begun with his conceiving an unaccountable hatred for the architect, and feeling relieved every time he went back to town. Now, sitting in the arbour, thinking of his examination next day and of his maman, at whom they laughed, he felt an intense desire to see Nyuta. That was what the Shumihins called Anna Fyodorovna, to hear her laughter and the rustle of her dress. This desire was not like the pure poetic love of which he read in novels, and about which he dreamed every night when he went to bed. It was strange, incomprehensible. He was ashamed of it and afraid of it, as of something very wrong and impure, something which it was disagreeable to confess even to himself. "It's not love," he said to himself. "One can't fall in love with women of 30 who are married. It's only a little intrigue, yes, an intrigue." Pondering on the intrigue, he thought of his uncontrollable shyness, his lack of moustache, his freckles, his narrow eyes, and put himself in his imagination side by side with Nyuta, and the juxtaposition seemed to him impossible. Then he made haste to imagine himself bold, handsome, witty, dressed in the latest fashion. When his dreams were at their height, as he sat huddled together and looking at the ground in a dark corner of the arbour, he heard the sounds of light footsteps. Some one was coming slowly along the avenue. Soon the steps stopped, and something white gleamed in the entrance. "Is there any one here?" asked a woman's voice. Volodya recognized the voice and raised his head in affright. "Who is here?" asked Nyuta, going into the arbour. "Ah, it is you, Volodya. What are you doing here? Thinking? And how can you go on thinking? That's the way to go out of your mind." Volodya got up and looked in a dazed way at Nyuta. She had only just come back from bathing. Over her shoulder there was hanging a sheet and a rough towel, and from under the white silk kerchief on her head he could see the wet hair sticking to her forehead. There was the cool, damp smell of the bath-house and of almond soap still hanging about her. She was out of breath from running quickly. The top button of her blouse was undone, so that the boy saw her throat and bosom. "Why don't you say something?" said Nyuta, looking Volodya up and down. "It's not polite to be silent when a lady talks to you. What a clumsy seal you are, though, Volodya. You always sit saying nothing, thinking like some philosopher. There's not a spark of life or fire in you. You are really horrid. At your age you ought to be living, skipping and jumping, chattering, flirting, falling in love." Volodya looked at the sheet that was held by a plump white hand and thought. "He's mute," said Nyuta with wonder. "It is strange, really. Listen, be a man. Come, you might smile at least. Phew! The horrid philosopher!" She laughed. "But do you know, Volodya, why you are such a clumsy seal? Because you don't devote yourself to the ladies. Why don't you? It's true, there are no girls here, but there's nothing to prevent your flirting with the married ladies. Why don't you flirt with me, for instance?" Volodya listened and scratched his forehead in acute and painful irresolution. "It's only very proud people who are silent and love solitude," Nyuta went on, pulling his hand away from his forehead. "You are proud, Volodya. Why do you look at me like that from under your brows? Look me straight in the face, if you please. Yes, now then, clumsy seal." Volodya made up his mind to speak. Wanting to smile, he twitched his lower lip, blinked, and again put his hand to his forehead. I love you," he said. Nyuta raised her eyebrows in surprise and laughed. "What do I hear?" she sang, as prima donnas sing at the opera when they hear something awful. "What? What did you say? Say it again! Say it again!" I love you," repeated Volodya. And without his will's having any part in his action, without reflection or understanding, he took half a step toward Nyuta and clutched her by the arm. Everything was dark before his eyes, and tears came into them. The whole world was turned into one big rough towel, which smelt of the bath-house. "Bravo! Bravo!" he heard a merry laugh. "Why don't you speak? I want you to speak. Well?" Seeing that he was not prevented from holding her arm, Volodya glanced at Nyuta's laughing face, and clumsily, awkwardly, put both arms around her waist, his hands meeting behind her back. He held her round the waist with both arms, while putting her hands up over her head, showing the dimples in her elbows, she set her hair straight under the kerchief and said in a calm voice: "You must be tactful, polite, charming, and you can only become that under feminine influence. But what a wicked, angry face you have! You must talk, laugh. Yes, Volodya, don't be surly. You are young, and will have plenty of time for philosophizing. Come, let go of me. I am going. Let's go." Without effort she released her waist, and humming something, walked out of the arbour. Volodya was left alone. He smoothed his hair, smiled, and walked 3 times to and fro across the arbour. Then he sat down on the bench and smiled again. He felt insufferably ashamed, so much so that he wondered that human shame could reach such a pitch of acuteness and intensity. Shame made him smile, gesticulate, and whisper some disconnected words. He was ashamed that he had been treated like a small boy, ashamed of his shyness, and most of all that he had had the audacity to put his arms round the waist of a respectable married woman, though, as it seemed to him, he had neither through age, nor by external quality, nor by social position, any right to do so. He jumped up, went out of the arbour, and without looking round walked into the recesses of the garden furthest from the house.
"Ah, only to get away from here as soon as possible," he thought, clutching his hand. "My God, as soon as possible!"
The train by which Volodya was to go back with his maman was at 8:40. There were 3 hours before the train started, but he would with pleasure have gone to the station at once, without waiting for his maman. At 8 o'clock he went to the house. His whole figure was expressive of determination. What would be, would be. He made up his mind to go in boldly, to look them straight in the face, to speak in a loud voice, regardless of everything. He crossed the terrace, the big hall, and the drawing-room, and there stopped to take breath. He could hear them in the dining-room, drinking tea. Madame Shumihin, maman, and Nyuta were talking and laughing about something. Volodya listened.
"I assure you,"
said Nyuta,
"I could not believe my eyes when he began declaring his passion, and just imagine, put his arms round my waist, I should not have recognised him. And you know, he has a way with him. When he told me he was in love with me, there was something brutal in his face, like a Circassian."
"Really?" gasped maman, going off into a peal of laughter. "Really?
How he does remind me of his father!"
Volodya ran back and dashed out into the open air.
How could they talk of it aloud?
He wondered in agony, clasping his hands and looking up to the sky in horror.
They talked aloud in cold blood, and mamma laughed. Mamma! My God, why didst thou give me such a mother? Why?
But he had to go to the house, come what might. He walked 3 times up and down the avenue, grew a little calmer, and went into the house.
"Why didn't you come in time for tea?"
Madame Shumihin asked sternly.
"I'm sorry, it's time for me to go,"
he muttered, not raising his eyes.
"Mamma, it's 8 o'clock."
"You go alone, my dear," said his maman languidly. "I am staying the night with Lily. Good-bye, my dear. Let me make the sign of the cross over you." She made the sign of the cross over her son, and said in French, turning to Nyuta,
"He's rather like Lermontov, isn't he?"
Saying good-bye after a fashion, without looking any one in the face, Volodya went out of the dining-room. 10 minutes later he was walking along the road to the station, and was glad of it. Now he felt neither frightened nor ashamed. He breathed freely and easily. About half a mile from the station he sat down on a stone by the side of the road and gazed at the sun, which was half hidden behind a barrow. There were lights already here and there at the station, and one green light glimmered dimly, but the train was not yet in sight. It was pleasant to Volodya to sit still without moving, and to watch the evening coming little by little. The darkness of the arbour, the footsteps, the smell of the bath-house, the laughter, and the waste, all those rose with amazing vividness before his imagination, and all this was no longer so terrible and important as before. "It is of no consequence. She did not pull her hand away, and laughed when I held her by the waist," he thought. "So she must have liked it. If she had disliked it, she would have been angry." And now Volodya felt sorry that he had not had more boldness there in the arbour. He felt sorry that he was so stupidly going away, and he was by now persuaded that if the same thing happened again, he would be bolder and look at it more simply. And it would not be difficult for the opportunity to occur again. They used to stroll about for a long time after supper at the Shumihins'. If Volodya went for a walk with Nyuta in the dark garden, there would be an opportunity. "I will go back," he thought, "and will go by the morning train to-morrow. I will say I have missed the train." And he turned back. Madame Shumihin, Maman, Nyuta, and one of the nieces were sitting on the veranda playing vint. When Volodya told them the lie that he had missed the train, they were uneasy that he might be late for the examination day, and advised him to get up early. All the while they were playing he sat on one side, greedily watching Nyuta and waiting. He already had a plan prepared in his mind. He would go up to Nyuta in the dark, would take her by the hand, then would embrace her. There would be no need to say anything, as both of them would understand without words. But after supper the ladies did not go for a walk in the garden, but went on playing cards. They played till 1 o'clock at night, and then broke up to go to bed. "How stupid it all is!" Volodya thought with vexation as he got into bed. "But never mind, I'll wait till to-morrow. To-morrow in the arbour. Doesn't matter." He did not attempt to go to sleep, but sat in bed, hugging his knees and thinking. All thought of the examination was hateful to him. He had already made up his mind that they would expel him, and that there was nothing terrible about his being expelled. On the contrary, it was a good thing, a very good thing, in fact. Next day he would be as free as a bird. He would put on ordinary clothes instead of his school uniform, would smoke openly, come out here and make love to Nyuta when he liked. And he would not be a schoolboy, but a young man. And as for the rest of it, what is called a career, a future, that was clear. Volodya would go into the army, or the telegraph service, or he would go into a chemist's shop and work his way up until he was a dispenser. There were lots of callings. An hour or two passed, and he was still sitting and thinking. Towards 3 o'clock, when it was beginning to get light, the door creaked cautiously, and his mamma came into the room. "Aren't you asleep?" she asked, yawning. "Go to sleep. I've only come in for a minute. I'm only fetching the drops." "What for?" "Poor Lily has got spasms again. Go to sleep, my child. Your examination's to-morrow." She took a bottle of something out of the cupboard, went to the window, read the label, and went away. "Marya Leontievna, those are not the drops," Volodya heard a woman's voice a minute later. "That's convallaria, and Lily wants morphine. Is your son asleep? Ask him to look for it." It was Nyuta's voice. Volodya turned cold. He hurriedly put on his trousers, flung his coat over his shoulders, and went to the door. "Do you understand? Morphine," Nyuta explained in a whisper. "There must be a label in Latin. Wake Volodya, he will find it." Mamma opened the door, and Volodya caught sight of Nyuta. She was wearing the same loose wrapper in which she had gone to bathe. Her hair hung loose and disordered on her shoulders. Her face looked sleepy and dark in the half-light. "Why, Volodya is not asleep," she said. "Volodya, look in the cupboard for the morphine. There's a dear. What a nuisance Lily is! She's always something the matter." Mamma muttered something, yawned and went away. "Look for it," said Nyuta. "Why are you standing still?" Volodya went to the cupboard, knelt down and began looking through the bottles and boxes of medicine. His hands were trembling, and he had a feeling in his chest and stomach as though cold waves were running all over his inside. He felt suffocated and giddy from the smell of ether, carbolic acid, and various drugs, which he quite unnecessarily snatched up with his trembling fingers and spilled in so doing. "I believe maman has gone," he thought. "It's a good thing, a good thing." "Will you be quick?" said Nyuta, drawling. "In a minute. Here, I believe this is morphine," said Volodya, reading on one of the labels the word "Here it is." Nyuta was standing in the doorway in such a way that one foot was in his room and one was in the passage. She was tidying her hair, which was difficult to put in order because it was so thick and long, and looked absent-mindedly at Volodya. In her loose wrap, with her sleepy face and her hair down, in the dim light that came into the white sky, not yet lit by the sun, she seemed to Volodya captivating, magnificent, fascinated, trembling all over, and remembering with relish how he had held that exquisite body in his arms in the arbour. He handed her the bottle and said: "How wonderful you are!" "What?" She came into the room. "What?" she asked, smiling. He was silent and looked at her. Then, just as in the arbour, he took her hand, and she looked at him with a smile and waited for what would happen next. "I love you," he whispered. She left off smiling, thought a minute, and said: "Wait a little, I think some one is coming. All those schoolboys," she said in an undertone, going to the door and peeping out into the passage. "No, there is no one to be seen." She came back. Then it seemed to Volodya that the room, Nyuta, the sunrise, and himself all melted together in one sensation of acute, extraordinary, incredible bliss, for which one might give up one's whole life and face eternal torments. But half a minute passed, and all that vanished. Volodya saw only a fat, plain face, distorted by an expression of repulsion, and he himself suddenly felt a loathing for what had happened. "I must go away, though," said Nyuta, looking at Volodya with disgust. "What a wretched, ugly, ugly duckling! How unseemly her long hair, her loose wrap, her steps, her voice seemed to Volodya now. Ugly duckling, he thought, after she had gone away. I really am ugly. Everything is ugly. The sun was rising. The birds were singing loudly. He could hear the gardener walking in the garden, and the creaking of his wheelbarrow. And soon afterwards he heard the lowing of the cows and the sounds of the shepherd's pipe. The sunlight and the sounds told him that somewhere in this world there is a pure, refined, poetical life. But where was it? Volodya had never heard a word of it from his mamma or any of the people round about him. Then the footman came to wake him for the morning train. He pretended to be asleep. "Bother it! Damn it all!" he thought. He got up between 10 and 11, combing his hair before the looking-glass, and looking at his ugly face, pale from his sleepless night, he thought, "It's perfectly true, an ugly duckling." When mamma saw him, and was horrified that he was not at his examination, Volodya said, "I overslept myself, maman. But don't worry, I will get a medical certificate." Madame Shumihin and Nyuta waked up at 1:00. Volodya heard Madame Shumihin open her window with a bang, heard Nyuta go off into a peal of laughter in reply to her coarse voice. He saw the door open and a string of nieces and other toadies, among the latter was his mamma, file into lunch, caught a glimpse of Nyuta's freshly washed, laughing face, and beside her the black brows and beard of her husband, the architect, who had just arrived. Nyuta was wearing a little Russian dress, which did not suit her at all and made her look clumsy. The architect was making dull and vulgar jokes. The rissoles served at lunch had too much onion in them, so it seemed to Volodya. It also seemed to him that Nyuta laughed loudly on purpose and kept glancing in his direction, to give him to understand that the memory of the night did not trouble her in the least, and that she was not aware of the presence at table of the ugly duckling. At 4:00 Volodya drove to the station with his mamma. Foul memories, the sleepless night, the prospect of expulsion from school, the stings of conscience, all roused in him now an oppressive, gloomy anger. He looked at maman's short profile, at her little nose, at the raincoat which was a present from Nyuta, and muttered, "Why do you powder? It's not becoming at your age. You make yourself up. Don't pay your debts at cards. Smoke other people's tobacco. It's hateful. I don't love you. I don't love you." He was insulting her, and she moved her little eyes about in alarm, flung up her hands, and whispered in horror, "What are you saying, my dear? Good gracious! The coachman will hear. Be quiet, or the coachman will hear. He can overhear everything." "I don't love you. I don't love you," he went on breathlessly. "You've no soul and no morals. Don't dare to wear that raincoat, you hear, or else I will tear it to rags." "Control yourself, my child." Maman went. "The coachman can hear." "And where is my father's fortune? Where is your money? You have wasted it all. And I am not ashamed of being poor, but I am ashamed of having such a mother. When my schoolfellows ask questions about you, I always blush." In the train they had to pass 2 stations before they reached the town. Volodya spent all the time on the little platform between 2 carriages and shivered all over. He did not want to go into the compartment, because there the mother he hated was sitting. He hated himself, hated the ticket collectors, the smoke from the engine, the cold to which he attributed his shivering. And the heavier the weight on his heart, the more strongly he felt that somewhere in the world, among some people, there was a pure, honourable, warm, refined life, full of love, affection, gaiety, and serenity. He felt this, and was so intensely miserable that one of the passengers, after looking at his face attentively, actually asked, "You have the toothache, I suppose?" In the town, maman and Volodya lived with Marya Petrovna, a lady of noble rank, who had a large flat and let rooms to boarders. Maman had two rooms, one with windows and two pictures in gold frames hanging on the walls, in which her bed stood and in which she lived, and a little room opening out of it in which Volodya lived. Here there was a sofa on which he slept, and, except that sofa, there was no other furniture. The rest of the room was entirely filled up with wicker baskets full of clothes, cardboard hat boxes, and all sorts of rubbish which Maman preserved for some reason or other. Volodya prepared his lessons either in his mother's room or in the general room, as the large room in which the boarders assembled at dinner time and in the evening was called. On reaching home he lay down on his sofa and put the quilt over him to stop his shivering. The cardboard hat boxes, the wicker baskets, and the other rubbish reminded him that he had not a room of his own, and that he had no refuge in which he could get away from his mother, from her visitors, and from the voices that were floating up from the general room. The satchel and the books lying about in the corners reminded him of the examination he had missed. For some reason there came into his mind, quite inappropriately, Menton, where he had lived with his father when he was 7 years old. He thought of Biarritz and two little English girls with whom he ran about on the sand. He tried to recall to his memory the colour of the sky, the sea, the height of the waves, and his mood at the time, but he could not succeed. The English girls flitted before his imagination, as though they were living. All the rest was a medley of images that floated away in confusion.
"No, it's cold here," thought Volodya.
He got up, put on his overcoat, and went into the general room. There they were drinking tea. There were 3 people at the samovar: Maman, an old lady with tortoiseshell pince-nez, who gave music lessons, and Avgustin Michailitch, an elderly and very stout Frenchman, who was employed at a perfumery factory. "I have had no dinner to-day," said Maman. "I have to send the maid to buy some bread." "Dunyasha!" shouted the Frenchman. It appeared that the maid had been sent out somewhere by the lady of the house.
That is of no consequence," said the Frenchman with a broad smile. "I will go for some bread myself at once. Oh, it is nothing."
He laid his strong, pungent cigar in a conspicuous place, put on his hat, and went out. After he had gone away, Maman began telling the music teacher how she had been staying at the Shumihins, and how warmly they welcomed her. "Lili Shumihin is a relative of mine, you know," she said. "Her late husband, General Shumihin, was a cousin of my husband, and she was a Baroness Kolb by birth."
"Maman, that's false," said Volodya irritably. "Why tell lies?"
He knew perfectly well that what his mother said was true. In what she was saying about General Shumihin and about Baroness Kolb there was not a word of lying, but nevertheless he felt she was lying. There was a suggestion of falsehood in her manner of speaking, in the expression of her face, in her eyes, in everything.
"You're lying,"
repeated Volodya, and he brought his fist down on the table with such force that all the crockery shook, and Maman's tea was spilt over.
"Why do you talk about generals and baronesses? It's all lies."
The music teacher was disconcerted, and coughed into her handkerchief, affecting to sneeze, and Maman began to cry.
"Where can I go?" thought Volodya.
He had been in the street already. He was ashamed to go to his schoolfellows. Again, quite incongruously, he remembered the 2 little English girls. He paced up and down the general room and went into Avgustin Michailitch's room. Here there was a strong smell of ethereal oils and glycerin soap. On the table, in the window, and even on the chairs, there were a number of bottles, glasses, and wine-glasses containing fluids of various colours. Volodya took up from the table a newspaper, opened it, and read the title, Figaro. There was a strong and pleasant scent about the paper. Then he took a revolver from the table. "There, don't take any notice of it." The music teacher was comforting maman in the next room. "He is young. Young people of his age never restrain themselves. One must resign oneself to that." "No, Yevgenia Andreevna, he's too spoilt," said maman in a sing-song voice. "He has no one in authority over him, and I am weak and can do nothing. Oh, I am unhappy." Volodya put the muzzle of the revolver to his mouth, felt something like a trigger or spring, and pressed it with his finger. Then felt something else projecting, and once more pressed it. Taking the muzzle out of his mouth, he wiped it with the lapel of his coat, looked at the lock. He had never in his life taken a weapon in his hand before. "I believe one ought to raise this," he reflected. "Yes, it seems so." Avgustin Michailitch went into the general room, and with a laugh began telling them about something. Volodya put the muzzle in his mouth again, pressed it with his teeth, and pressed something with his fingers. There was the sound of a shot. Something hit Volodya in the back of his head with terrible violence, and he fell on the table with his face downwards among the bottles and glasses. Then he saw his father, as in Menton, in a top hat with a wide black band on it, wearing mourning for some lady, suddenly seize him by both hands, and they fell headlong into a very deep, dark pit. Then everything was blurred.
Chapter 7 of The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett. Chapter 7 The Husband. In the course of the maneuvers, the N Cavalry Regiment halted for a night at the district town of K. Such an event as the visit of officers always has the most exciting and inspiring effect on the inhabitants of provincial towns. The shopkeepers dream of getting rid of rusty sausages and best brand sardines that have been lying for 10 years on their shelves. The inns and restaurants keep open all night. The military commandant, his secretary, and the local garrison put on their best uniforms. The police flit to and fro like mad, while the effect on the ladies is beyond all description. The ladies of K, hearing the regiment approaching, forsook their pans of boiling jam and ran into the street. Forgetting their morning decibel and general untidiness, they rushed breathless with excitement to meet the regiment, and listened greedily to the band playing the march. Looking at their pale, ecstatic faces, one might have thought those strains came from some heavenly choir, rather than from a military brass band. "The regiment!" they cried joyfully. "The regiment is coming!" What could this unknown regiment that came by chance today and would depart at dawn tomorrow mean to them? Afterwards, when the officers were standing in the middle of the square and with their hands behind them discussing the question of billets, all the ladies were gathered together at the examining magistrates and vying with one another in their criticisms of the regiment. They already knew, goodness knows how, that the colonel was married but not living with his wife, that the senior officer's wife had a baby born dead every year, that the adjutant was hopelessly in love with some countess and had even once attempted suicide. They knew everything. When a pockmarked soldier in a red shirt darted past the windows, they knew for certain that it was Lieutenant Rimesov's orderly running about the town trying to get some English bitter ale on tick for his master. They had only caught a passing glimpse of the officers' backs, but had already decided that there was not one handsome or interesting man among them. Having talked to their heart's content, they sent for the military commandant and the committee of the club and instructed them at all costs to make arrangements for a dance. Their wishes were carried out. At 9 o'clock in the evening, the military band was playing in the street before the club, while in the club itself the officers were dancing with the ladies of K. The ladies felt as though they were on wings. Intoxicated by the dancing, the music, and the clank of spurs, they threw themselves heart and soul into making the acquaintance of their new partners, and quite forgot their old civilian friends. Their fathers and husbands, forced temporarily into the background, crowded around the meager refreshment table in the entrance hall. All these government cashiers, secretaries, clerks, and superintendents, stale, sickly-looking, clumsy figures, were perfectly well aware of their inferiority. They did not even enter the ballroom, but contented themselves with watching their wives and daughters in the distance dancing with the accomplished and graceful officers. Among the husbands was Shalikov the tax collector, a narrow, spiteful soul given to drink, with a big, closely cropped head and thick, protruding lips. He had a university education. There had been a time when he used to read progressive literature and sing student songs. But now, as he said of himself, he was a tax collector and nothing more. He stood leaning against the doorpost, his eyes fixed on his wife, Anna Pavlovna, a little brunette of 30 with a long nose and a pointed chin. Tightly laced, with her face carefully powdered, she danced without pausing for breath, danced till she was ready to drop exhausted. But though she was exhausted in body, her spirit was inexhaustible. One could see as she danced that her thoughts were with the past, that far-away past when she used to dance at the College for Young Ladies, dreaming of a life of luxury and gaiety, and never doubting that her husband was to be a prince, or at the worst a baron. The tax collector watched, scowling with spite. It was not jealousy he was feeling. He was ill-humored. First, because the room was taken up with dancing, and there was nowhere he could play a game of cards. Secondly, because he could not endure the sound of wind instruments. And thirdly, because he fancied the officers treated the civilians somewhat too casually and disdainfully. But what above everything revolted him and moved him to indignation was the expression of happiness on his wife's face. "It makes me sick to look at her," he muttered, "going on for 40, and nothing to boast of at any time, and she must powder her face and lace herself up, and frizzing her hair, flirting and making faces, and fancying she's doing the thing in style. Oh, you're a pretty figure, upon my soul." Anna Pavlovna was so lost in the dance that she did not once glance at her husband. "Of course not. Where do we poor country bumpkins come in?" sneered the tax collector. "We are at a discount now. We're clumsy seals, unpolished provincial bears, and she's the queen of the ball. She's kept enough of her looks to please even officers. They'd not object to making love to her, I dare say." During the mazurka, the tax collector's face twitched with spite. A black-haired officer with prominent eyes and Tartar cheekbones danced the mazurka with Anna Pavlovna. Assuming a stern expression, he worked his legs with gravity and feeling, and so crooked his knees that he looked like a jack-a-dandy pulled by strings, while Anna Pavlovna, pale and thrilled, bending her figure languidly and turning her eyes up, tried to look as though she scarcely touched the floor, and evidently felt herself that she was not on earth, not at the local club, but somewhere far, far away, in the clouds. Not only her face, but her whole figure was expressive of beatitude. The tax collector could endure it no longer. He felt a desire to jeer at that beatitude, to make Anna Pavlovna feel that she had forgotten herself, that life was by no means so delightful as she fancied now in her excitement. "You wait. I'll teach you to smile so blissfully," he muttered. "You are not a boarding school miss. You are not a girl. An old fright ought to realize she is a fright." Petty feelings of envy, vexation, wounded vanity, of that small provincial misanthropy engendered in petty officials by vodka and a sedentary life, swarmed in his heart like mice. Waiting for the end of the mazurka, he went into the hall and walked up to his wife. Anna Pavlovna was sitting with her partner, and flirting her fan and coquettishly dropping her eyelids, was describing how she used to dance in Petersburg. Her lips were pursed up like a rosebud, and she pronounced, "At home in Petersburg." "Anyuta, let us go home," croaked the tax collector. Seeing her husband standing before her, Anna Pavlovna started, as though recalling the fact that she had a husband. Then she flushed all over. She felt ashamed that she had such a sickly-looking, ill-humored, ordinary husband. "Let us go home," repeated the tax collector. "Why? It's quite early." "I beg you to come home," said the tax collector deliberately, with a spiteful expression. "Why? Has anything happened?" Anna Pavlovna asked in a flutter. "Nothing has happened, but I wish you to go home at once." "I wish it, that's enough. And without further talk, please." Anna Pavlovna was not afraid of her husband, but she felt ashamed on account of her partner, who was looking at her husband with surprise and amusement. She got up and moved a little apart with her husband. "What notion is this?" she began. "Why go home? Why, it's not 11 o'clock. "I wish it, and that's enough. Come along, and that's all about it." "Don't be silly. Go home alone if you want to." "All right, then I shall make a scene." The tax collector saw the look of beatitude gradually vanish from his wife's face, saw how ashamed and miserable she was, and he felt a little happier. "Why do you want me at once?" asked his wife. "I don't want you, but I wish you to be at home. I wish it, that's all." At first Anna Pavlovna refused to hear of it. Then she began entreating her husband to let her stay just another half hour. Then, without knowing why, she began to apologize, to protest, and all in a whisper, with a smile, that the spectators might not suspect that she was having a tiff with her husband. She began assuring him she would not stay long, only another 10 minutes, only 5 minutes. But the tax collector stuck obstinately to his point. "Stay if you like," he said, "but I'll make a scene if you do." And as she talked to her husband, Anna Pavlovna looked thinner, older, plainer. Pale, biting her lips, and almost crying, she went out to the entry and began putting on her things. "You're not going?" asked the ladies in surprise. "Anna Pavlovna, you're not going, dear?" "Her head aches," said the tax collector for his wife. Coming out of the club, the husband and the wife walked all the way home in silence. The tax collector walked behind his wife, and watching her downcast, sorrowful, humiliated little figure, he recalled the look of beatitude which had so irritated him at the club, and the consciousness that the beatitude was gone filled his soul with triumph. He was pleased and satisfied, and at the same time he felt a lack of something. He would have liked to go back to the club and make everyone feel dreary and miserable, so that all might know how stale and worthless life is when you walk along the streets in the dark and hear the slush of the mud under your feet, and when you know that you will wake up the next morning with nothing to look forward to but vodka and cards. Oh, how awful it is! And Anna Pavlovna could scarcely walk. She was still under the influence of the dancing, the music, the talk, the lights, and the noise. She asked herself as she walked along why God had thus afflicted her. She felt miserable, insulted, and choking with hate as she listened to her husband's heavy footsteps. She was silent, trying to think of the most offensive, biting, and venomous words she could hurl at her husband, and at the same time she was fully aware that no word could penetrate her tax collector's hide. What did he care for words? Her bitterest enemy could not have contrived for her a more helpless position. And meanwhile the band was playing, and the darkness was full of the most rousing, intoxicating dance tunes. End of chapter